I woke up in my hotel room with my head pounding and the bitter taste of betrayal on my tongue. My white wedding dress, the one I'd dreamed about since I was 7 years old, lay in shreds across the floor like the remains of my shattered trust. Written in red paint beside the torn silk were 5 words that stopped my heart: better ruined than married to him. Those words were in my mother's handwriting. For 25 years, I thought Edward and Vivian Mercer were overprotective parents who just wanted what was best for me. I was wrong. Dead wrong. They weren't protecting me, they were protecting their investment. And when I chose love over their arranged marriage to Jonathan Pierce, they showed me exactly what I was worth to them. They drugged their own daughter, destroyed my wedding dress with their bare hands, whispered those devastating words as they watched me break. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot about Grandmother Beatrice's diamond dress, the one hanging in my closet with secrets sewn into its very fabric. Secrets that could destroy them. The next morning, I walked into my own wedding wearing $4 million worth of diamonds and carrying evidence that would bring my parents to their knees. The moment they saw me, their faces drained of all color. Edward actually whispered, "No, it can't be that dress." But it was. And by the end of this story, my parents would learn that some betrayals cost more than they ever imagined. Much more. This is the story of how I lost my family and found my power. My name is Caroline Mercer, and at 25, I thought I understood what family meant. As a junior curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I spent my days surrounded by priceless artifacts that had survived centuries of human greed and betrayal. I never imagined I'd become one myself. Growing up as the daughter of Edward Mercer, one of New York's most successful real estate moguls, I'd always known my parents had expectations for my life, but I believed their love came without conditions. I was catastrophically wrong. The pounding in my skull felt like a jackhammer against concrete as consciousness slowly dragged me back to the world. My mouth tasted like I'd been chewing on copper pennies mixed with something bitter and medicinal. The hotel room spun lazily around me as I tried to focus my vision, blinking repeatedly to clear the fog that seemed to cling to my thoughts like spiderwebs. What had happened to me? The last thing I remembered was sitting across from my parents at Le Bernardin, their faces unusually serious as they insisted we needed to have one final conversation before my wedding to Daniel tomorrow. "Caroline, sweetheart," my mother Vivian had said, her manicured fingers wrapped around her wine glass. "We just want what's best for you. This marriage to Daniel is happening so fast. Are you absolutely certain you've thought this through?" Her voice had carried that familiar tone of loving concern that I'd heard my entire life. But something about it felt different that night. Sharper, more calculating. My father Edward had nodded gravely, his steel-gray eyes fixed on mine with unusual intensity. "Your mother's right, Caroline. Marriage is a serious business decision, not just a romantic fantasy. We've arranged for Jonathan to join us for dessert. He's still very interested in pursuing a relationship with you, and frankly, he offers the kind of stability that Daniel simply cannot provide." I should have left the restaurant the moment Jonathan Pierce walked through the door with his predatory smile and his perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel made in 3 months. Instead, I'd stayed foolishly believing I could convince my parents that love mattered more than stock portfolios and social connections. The wine my mother had ordered for me tasted slightly off, but I'd attributed it to nerves about the confrontation I knew was coming. Now, lying in my hotel bed with my head feeling like it had been stuffed with cotton, I realized that bitter aftertaste hadn't been nerves at all. They had drugged me. My own parents had drugged me. The room tilted dangerously as I forced myself to sit up, gripping the edge of the mattress to steady myself. Something white caught my peripheral vision, and I turned my head slowly, afraid any sudden movement might trigger another wave of nausea. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. My wedding dress lay scattered across the hotel room floor like the remains of a beautiful bird that had been torn apart by predators. The ivory silk that I'd fallen in love with at first sight was now nothing more than shredded fabric cut and ripped with such vicious precision that whoever had done this had taken their time savoring each destructive slash. The delicate pearl buttons that had taken the seamstress hours to hand sew were scattered like tears across the carpet. The cathedral-length train that was supposed to flow behind me as I walked down the aisle to Daniel had been reduced to ribbons. But it was the message painted on the floor in blood-red letters that made my heart stop completely, "Don't marry him." The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. I'd seen those same perfectly formed letters on birthday cards, Christmas notes, and childhood lunch money envelopes for 25 years. The distinctive way she crossed her T's, the elegant loop of her Y's, the precise spacing between each word. This wasn't some random act of vandalism by a stranger. This was personal. This was family. My hands shook as I reached for my phone muscle memory, taking over where rational thought had failed. The hotel's number was programmed from when I'd made the reservation back when I still believed my parents were simply overprotective rather than genuinely dangerous. The front desk transferred me to security without question, and within minutes, a kind-faced man in his 50s was standing in my doorway, his expression growing increasingly grave as he surveyed the destruction. "Miss Mercer, I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "Let me pull up our security footage and see if we can identify who did this to your room." I sat on the edge of the bed wrapped in the hotel's terry cloth robe, watching as he scrolled through hours of digital surveillance on his tablet. My heart hammered against my ribs as familiar figures appeared on the screen. There was my father, Edward Mercer, looking perfectly composed in his expensive navy suit as he approached my hotel room door at 2:30 in the morning. Behind him stood Jonathan Pierce, carrying what looked like a small duffel bag. "Ma'am," the security guard said quietly, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Your father signed the visitor log himself. He wanted us to know he had permission to be here." Sitting in that devastated hotel room staring at the security guard's tablet showing my father's signature on the visitor log, I felt the foundations of my entire childhood crumbling beneath me like sand. The man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had attended every school play and graduation ceremony, had signed his name with a flourish before entering my room to destroy the most important dress of my life. But as the shock began to wear off and rational thought slowly returned, I realized this betrayal shouldn't have surprised me at all. The signs had been there for years, carefully disguised as parental concern and family tradition. My sister Natalie had always been the golden child, the one who instinctively understood what our parents wanted to hear and never questioned the invisible rules that governed our household. She was 2 years older than me, blonde, where I was brunette, compliant, where I was curious, and she had mastered the art of making Edward and Vivian Mercer feel like the most brilliant parents in Manhattan's Upper East Side. From the time we were small children, Natalie seemed to possess some internal compass that guided her toward exactly the right response to any situation, while I stumbled through family interactions like I was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I remembered being 8 years old, sitting at our formal dining table as my father discussed a particularly complex real estate deal he was negotiating. Natalie, barely 10, had nodded solemnly and asked intelligent questions about market values and zoning regulations, her small face earnest and engaged. When I had innocently wondered aloud why anyone would want to tear down a beautiful old building to put up another boring office tower, the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. My mother's fork had paused halfway to her mouth, and my father's jaw had tightened in that particular way that meant I had disappointed him again. "Caroline," my mother had said in her carefully modulated voice, "that kind of thinking is exactly why some people succeed in business, and others spend their lives working for people like your father. Buildings aren't about beauty, sweetheart. They're about profit and progress." Natalie had given me a look that was part sympathy and part superiority, and I had learned another lesson about keeping my thoughts to myself when they didn't align with the Mercer family values. Over the years, those lessons accumulated like small cuts, each one teaching me that my natural curiosity and independence were character flaws that needed to be corrected rather than qualities to be celebrated. The pattern had continued throughout our teenage years, with Natalie effortlessly gliding through the social expectations that felt like straitjackets to me. She dated the right boys from the right families, chose extracurricular activities that enhanced her college applications rather than following genuine interests, and never once questioned why our parents seemed to know exactly whom she should befriend and which parties she should attend. When I had tried to join the debate team instead of the country club tennis lessons my mother had arranged, the reaction had been swift and devastating. "Caroline, darling." My father had said, his voice carrying that tone of disappointed patience I knew so well. "You're being deliberately difficult again. We've invested considerable time and money in your tennis instruction, and abandoning it now for something as unmarketable as debate shows exactly the kind of poor judgment we're trying to help you overcome." My mother had nodded in agreement, adding, "Natalie would never be so ungrateful about the opportunities we provide. Perhaps you need to spend some time thinking about whether you want to continue being the kind of daughter who fights her parents' guidance at every turn." The punishment for my resistance had been weeks of cold politeness, withheld affection, and pointed comparisons to my sister's superior decision-making abilities. I had learned that love in the Mercer household was conditional, doled out as a reward for compliance, and withdrawn as punishment for independence. Natalie had learned the same lesson, but had chosen to embrace it rather than fight it, earning her the kind of consistent parental approval that I craved, but could never seem to achieve. But it was the whispered conversations that should have warned me about what was truly happening in our family. Throughout my childhood and teenage years, I had occasionally walked into rooms where my parents were having intense, quiet discussions that stopped the moment they noticed my presence. These conversations always left them looking slightly guilty and overly bright, as if they were actors who had forgotten their lines and were improvising their way back into character. I had caught fragments over the years, references to protecting the family legacy and ensuring that both girls understand their obligations. Most disturbing were the repeated mentions of someone they referred to simply as V. Someone who apparently had strong opinions about how Edward and Vivian should handle their daughters' futures. The way they spoke about this mysterious V suggested both respect and fear, as if this person held some kind of authority over our family that even my powerful father couldn't challenge. V thinks we're being too lenient with Caroline's rebellious phase. I had heard my mother whisper to my father one evening when I was 17, standing just outside the library door where they thought they couldn't be overheard. "V is right," my father had replied grimly. "We need to maintain better control, or Caroline's independence could jeopardize everything we've worked to build. The plan only works if both girls fulfill their roles." Those whispered conversations about V helping them control me suddenly felt sinister, like they'd been planning my future since childhood. I remember leaving that evening's uneasy family gathering with a heaviness in my chest, the words about family legacy and whispered names like V still lingering in my ears. I needed air, something that felt untainted by schemes and parental expectations. And so when Grandma Beatrice suggested we attend the opening of her friend's art exhibition downtown, I agreed without hesitation. She always had a way of knowing when I needed to step away from the Mercer household's suffocating grip, as though she could read the storms gathering behind my practiced smile. The gallery smelled faintly of varnish and old wood, and the lighting seemed designed to invite reverence rather than awe. Soft pools illuminating canvases and sculptures collected across decades. Guests floated from piece to piece, their voices carrying the familiar notes of appraisal. I had grown up around questions about provenance valuations, whispered in a conspiratorial hush, speculation about how a piece might appreciate in the next 5 years. I braced myself for the usual chorus of greed disguised as culture, but then I noticed a young man standing alone in front of a centuries-old oil painting of a family gathered around a humble table. He wasn't discussing market value or asking whether the piece had been restored. Instead, He studied it with an intensity that seemed almost out of place amid the chatter of society regulars. His expression carried quiet reverence, as if he could hear the voices of the long-dead artist and subjects still lingering in the brushstrokes. Something about the way his shoulders tilted slightly forward, unguarded and vulnerable, compelled me to step closer. I expected him to ignore me the way most men at these functions did, either because I was a Mercer daughter, and thus a potential chess piece, or because I wasn't Natalie, who had always been treated as the more desirable one. But when he turned his head and our eyes met, his gaze didn't measure or weigh me. It simply welcomed me open and curious, as though he was grateful I had joined him in front of this painting. He said quietly, almost to himself, "You can see the way the artist loved these people. It isn't about showing wealth or prestige. It's about capturing how they belonged to one another, even in their poverty." I found myself smiling, a genuine one I hadn't felt in weeks. "Most people here are wondering how much it's worth," I replied, testing whether he was truly different or merely playing a part. He shook his head, almost amused. "If you're asking about worth, you've already missed the point." We lingered in front of that painting for several minutes, speaking in low tones about what we noticed: the child's worn shoes, the father's tired hands, the mother's serene smile despite the clear evidence of hardship. Each observation felt like peeling back a layer of meaning, and before I realized it, we had drifted away from art into pieces of ourselves. He introduced himself as Daniel Hartman, a history teacher at a local college, his passion evident in the way his voice warmed when he spoke about his students, and how he tried to teach them that the past was not just dates and battles, but human choices and consequences. I confessed that I often felt trapped in my own family's history, bound to their definitions of success and duty. He didn't look shocked or dismissive. He simply nodded as though he understood the weight of inherited chains. We moved together through the gallery, our conversation deepening with every painting and sculpture we paused to examine. While others around us calculated potential investments, Daniel and I spoke about what it meant to live a life that felt real rather than curated. He told me he dreamed of owning a small house with a garden, a place where he could plant roots without needing to impress anyone. I admitted that I longed for mornings free of my parents' manipulative demands, where love wasn't a transaction measured in obedience and appearances. It felt daring to say it out loud, but Daniel's presence made honesty easier. At one point, he said something that struck a chord so profound, it left me silent for a beat. Family is supposed to be where loyalty comes naturally, not where it's traded like currency. If loyalty has to be bought, it isn't loyalty at all. I thought of Edward and Vivian, of their endless negotiations disguised as parenting, of the way they rewarded Natalie for compliance and punished me for independence. His words illuminated a truth I had long buried. My parents didn't want children, they wanted investments. With Daniel, the contrast was too stark to ignore. He valued people for who they were, not what they could yield. Beatrice watched us from across the room, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When she finally beckoned me to her side, I excused myself from Daniel reluctantly, though he smiled in a way that promised he wasn't going anywhere. Beatrice's hand was cool but firm as she led me toward a quieter corner beneath a marble bust. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice, low and deliberate, carried the weight of decades of knowing how my parents operated. "That young man is dangerous to them, Caroline. Do you see the way you glow around him? Do you hear how differently you speak when you're near him? Your parents will see it too, and they will not tolerate it." My instinct was to protest, to say she was exaggerating, but deep down I knew she was right. Edward and Vivian had already begun tightening their grip on my future, whispering about alliances and obligations, and here I was standing beside someone who embodied everything they feared: independence, authenticity, love without conditions. They can't control who I care about. I said, though, even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded naive. Beatrice squeezed my hand. "Caroline, you underestimate how far your parents will go when they believe the family legacy is at stake. They've been shaping your life since you were a child, twisting your choices to fit their mold. If Daniel threatens their plans, they will do whatever it takes to remove him, whatever it takes." Her words settled over me like a chill seeping into my bones. I wanted to dismiss her warning as paranoia born of old grudges, but I had seen enough of Edward and Vivian's machinations to know she wasn't imagining shadows. The memory of overheard whispers about controlling me, the secrecy, the punishments for stepping out of line, those were real, not inventions. I looked back across the gallery where Daniel stood examining another painting with the same quiet reverence, unaware that forces larger than either of us were already aligning against him. Beatrice's voice softened, but the warning sharpened in its clarity. "You must be careful, my dear. Love can be the strongest shield, but it also paints the brightest target." I swallowed hard, torn between the rush of hope Daniel inspired and the dread curling in my stomach. Grandma Beatrice's warning about my parents felt like prophecy, but I never imagined they'd go as far as drugging their own daughter. When I left the gallery that night, Beatrice's warning about Daniel stayed with me, but it also stirred something deeper, like a door opening to memories I had kept tucked away. I remembered being much younger still, a teenager sitting beside her in the garden where the roses refused to bloom properly, no matter how carefully she trimmed them. That was where she first told me the truth about my parents in a voice so steady, it terrified me more than any outburst could have. She said Edward and Vivian never looked at me as a daughter the way parents should. To them, I was a business asset, a name on a ledger, a bargaining chip to be exchanged for influence or stability. They might wrap it in words like duty or family honor, but at the core, she told me they would trade away my happiness without a flicker of hesitation if it meant securing their wealth. At the time, I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss it as exaggeration. I clung to the belief that no parents could be so cold, but even then I could not deny the patterns I had lived with for years. Natalie was praised for compliance, for repeating their views like a well-trained student, while I was punished whenever I questioned decisions or voiced my own desires. If Natalie was the daughter they displayed like polished silver, I was the problem child they tried to bend into shape, and Beatrice had been the only one who admitted aloud what I had already begun to sense. There was another memory, even sharper, from the evening she called me into her study. The room was her sanctuary, lined with shelves of books and small artifacts collected during travels she rarely spoke about. She closed the door behind me and pulled out a long bundle wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, my breath caught. It was a dress, but not like any I had ever seen. Under the lamplight, it shimmered as though stitched with starlight itself. Tiny diamonds, hundreds of them, had been woven into the bodice and skirt in such a subtle design that at first glance it seemed merely an elegant gown. But when the light shifted, the gems glowed like constellations across the fabric. I whispered that it was beautiful, and she did not smile. Instead, she looked at me gravely and said, "This is not just a dress. It is a shield. Hidden inside its seams is something powerful, documents, records, truths that Edward and Vivian would never want revealed." She explained that she had concealed evidence of their darkest dealings within the dress, knowing a day would come when I would need protection against them. I remember feeling my knees weaken as she continued. She told me my parents had already begun arranging a marriage for me. Discussions whispered behind closed doors since I was 16. Men like Jonathan had been in their orbit for years, men chosen not for affection or character, but for their ability to secure alliances and wealth. She said they would present it as duty, as loyalty to the Mercer name, but at its heart, it was nothing more than a transaction, a sale in which I was the currency. I asked her why she was telling me then, why not expose them outright? Her eyes, lined with age and sorrow, met mine steadily. "Timing," she said. "Evidence revealed at the wrong moment can be dismissed, buried, or turned against the one who wields it. But when the time is right, this dress will be your armor. Until then, you must keep it secret, even from yourself." The weight of that evening has never left me. I can still feel the cool texture of the gems beneath my fingertips, and the way her words settled into my chest like stones. At 16, I wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding that my parents, for all their flaws, would never barter away my life. But the years since then proved her right again and again. Every decision they made about me was tied to money, reputation, or leverage, Their affection was conditional, their approval purchased with obedience, and every act of independence I dared to show was met with punishment or calculated coldness. Now, as I sat alone after meeting Daniel, those memories resurfaced with terrible clarity. He represented everything my grandmother had warned me about. Not because he was dangerous, but because his love was genuine, unpurchased, uncontrollable. To my parents, that authenticity was a threat they could not manipulate, and I could already feel them tightening their grip. Beatrice had known this day would come. She had prepared for it with more foresight than I understood at the time, leaving me not only the dress, but the knowledge that my survival would depend on remembering her words when the storm arrived. I often wonder how she bore it all, watching her own son and daughter-in-law transform into people who valued fortune over family. Perhaps that was why she hid the evidence so carefully, why she placed her faith not in confrontation, but in legacy. She trusted that I would one day have the courage to stand against them, that the steel she said she saw in me would not rust beneath years of manipulation. At the time, I thought she was burdening me with secrets too heavy for a girl my age. Now I realize she was equipping me, handing me a weapon disguised as beauty. The memory of her voice still echoes when I close my eyes. She told me plainly that Edward and Vivian would use any means necessary to force my compliance. If threats and shame did not work, they would escalate. They would paint me as unstable, twist my choices into evidence of disobedience, and isolate me until I had nowhere to turn. Her prediction has already begun to unfold. Every step closer I take toward a life of my own choosing, every glance I share with Daniel, only sharpens their resolve to bring me back under control. That night, I opened the trunk at the foot of my bed where the dress lay hidden beneath layers of protective cloth. Even without touching it, I could feel its weight not just in jewels, but in secrets stitched into every seam. It was both terrifying and comforting to know that within that gown rested proof strong enough to shatter the empire my parents had built. My fingers hovered above it, trembling with the knowledge that someday soon I might need to put it on, not as attire, but as armor. Grandma's final words haunted me. Your parents love money more than they love you. Caroline, the diamond dress will prove it when the time comes. I could not stop thinking about the dress lying in the trunk at the foot of my bed, and the words Beatrice had spoken with such conviction. It made every glance from my parents feel sharper, every silence heavier, as though they knew I was beginning to question the boundaries of their control. The unease grew heavier the evening they invited me to a dinner they claimed was in honor of a family friend visiting from out of town. My instincts told me it was more than that, and I was right. When I walked into the dining room of the Mercer estate, Jonathan Whitfield rose smoothly from his chair, the kind of man who seemed rehearsed down to the angle of his smile. He was tall, immaculately dressed, his watch gleaming under the chandelier. My parents flanked him like proud merchants unveiling a prized product. Caroline, my father said with deliberate warmth, "This is Jonathan. He is everything we could hope for in a partner for you and for the family." Jonathan extended his hand as if this were a business negotiation rather than a personal introduction, and I forced myself to take it. His grip was firm, confident, and I hated how easily he slid into the rhythm of our family, as though he had always belonged at our table. Dinner began with polite conversation, but I could hear the calculation beneath every word. My parents praised Jonathan's acumen in business, how he had already expanded his holdings, and how seamlessly his ventures could align with Mercer Enterprises. Jonathan responded with the same rehearsed graciousness, speaking of family synergy and mutual growth, as though he and my parents were negotiating a merger. I sat silently, my fork idle against my plate, while they discussed me in the third person, even as I sat between them. My father said Caroline will appreciate a husband who understands responsibility, who values tradition. My mother smiled thinly and added, "She has always needed guidance to see where her duty lies." I clenched my jaw, but said nothing, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. It became clear during the second course that this dinner was not a casual introduction, but the unveiling of a plan that had been months, maybe years in the making. My parents and Jonathan spoke openly about financial terms, how assets could be structured once the marriage was completed, which properties would remain in the Mercer name, and which could be transferred to joint ownership. They did not bother lowering their voices when I excused myself briefly, stepping into the hallway to breathe. From there, concealed by the edge of the doorframe, I heard Jonathan's tone shift lower and more strategic. "She seems resistant," he said. "How do you plan to handle that?" My father's answer was cold. "Caroline has always been emotional. She will learn. If she does not, we have ways of reminding her what she owes this family." My mother chuckled softly, the sound slicing into me. "She will comply. She always does eventually. Once the assets are secured, there will be no going back." I stood frozen, my stomach twisting, my fingernails pressing into the wood of the doorway. They were dividing my life as though I were nothing but a ledger to be balanced, a resource to be allocated. My feelings, my choices, even my love for Daniel, none of it mattered. They had already decided, and Jonathan was a willing accomplice. I returned to the table before they noticed my absence, my face carefully composed, though inside I trembled. Jonathan greeted me with a smile that revealed nothing but self-assurance, as if he knew victory was inevitable. When dessert was served, my mother turned to me directly for the first time all evening. Her voice carried the softness she used when dressing cruelty as care. "Caroline, you must understand that Jonathan is a man who comprehends family obligations. He values stability, loyalty, and the preservation of legacy. He is not like Daniel, who has nothing to offer but ideals that crumble under the weight of reality. Jonathan will give you the life you need, whether you realize it now or not." I met her gaze, searching for any trace of maternal warmth, but all I saw was calculation. "You expect me to accept this without a say?" I asked quietly. She leaned closer, her perfume cloying her eyes, unyielding. "We expect you to do your duty. That is what is required. Personal feelings fade, but duty endures. You will thank us one day." The rest of the evening passed in a blur, voices blending into the clatter of silverware and the steady thud of my own heartbeat. I barely tasted the food, barely registered Jonathan's compliments about the wine, or my father's boasts about future ventures. I felt like a spectator at my own sentencing, trapped at a table where my future was being carved apart like the roast before us. I thought of Daniel's gentle certainty, of the way he looked at a painting and saw humanity rather than profit, and I realized with sickening clarity that my parents would stop at nothing to erase him from my life. When at last the dinner ended, Jonathan departed with the easy confidence of a man who believed the deal was already sealed. My parents watched him go with satisfaction glinting in their eyes, then turned to me with the expectation of gratitude. I excused myself, retreating upstairs, each step heavier than the last. In the quiet of my room, I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, trying to process the betrayal. Hearing my own mother discuss selling me like property to Jonathan made me realize my parents had never seen me as their daughter, just as their most valuable asset. The memory of that dinner with Jonathan still burned in my mind, the way my parents had spoken of me like a contract waiting to be signed. I knew that if I stayed silent, they would carry me along like a pawn across their chessboard, and soon it would be too late. So when the next family gathering was arranged at the estate, I made a choice. I dressed with intention, not in the subdued tones my mother preferred, but in a color that reminded me of the freedom I tasted with Daniel, something vivid that could not be ignored. The dining room was lit too brightly, the chandelier's crystals scattering light across silverware and crystal glasses, but nothing could disguise the tension pulsing beneath the surface. Jonathan was present again, seated as though he already belonged to the family, his hand resting casually on the arm of the chair my parents had placed beside mine. My father presided at the head of the table, his posture commanding, while my mother fluttered between hostess and strategist, her smile too wide, her eyes darting between me and Jonathan. The courses were served with precision, the staff moving silently, but I hardly tasted a bite. My chest tightened with each toast, each compliment directed at Jonathan's integrity and business acumen, as though the dinner were a rehearsal for a press release announcing our union. I caught Natalie watching me from across the table, her expression unreadable, perhaps curious to see if I would bow to the inevitable, as she often did. Jonathan leaned slightly toward me during the main course, his voice low, his words calculated. "Your parents have such faith in us. I think we'll make a remarkable team." I looked at him, my jaw stiff. "I am not a business venture," I replied quietly. He smiled as though I had made a charming joke, then turned his attention back to my father, seamlessly continuing their conversation about potential partnerships. It was during dessert that the moment came. Jonathan rose from his chair with a practiced ease, the room falling into a hush as he lifted his glass. He turned to me, his smile confident, and began speaking of loyalty, of the honor of joining two respected families, of the bright future that awaited us. Then, before the assembled relatives and associates, he knelt and presented a ring that glittered under the chandelier's glare. My mother gasped theatrically, her hand clutching her chest, while my father's approving nod gave the entire charade the weight of inevitability. All eyes turned to me, expectation pressing down like a heavy cloak. I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor, my pulse hammering. For a moment I considered the silence that would make this easier for everyone, the compliance that would earn me peace in the short term. But then Daniel's face came to mind, the quiet strength in his eyes, the sincerity that no arrangement could replicate, and I knew I could not betray myself. My voice shook only at the beginning. "Jonathan," I said clearly, "I cannot accept. I will not marry you. I am in love with someone else, and it is with him that I will build my life." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My mother's face drained of color before flushing crimson, and my father's hand gripped the edge of the table as though to anchor himself. Edward's explosion was swift and violent, his fist slamming onto the table so hard that the silver rattled. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" he roared, his eyes blazing. "You are throwing away the future of this family, years of planning, everything we have built for what? For some penniless dreamer who has nothing to offer but empty words." His voice carried the fury of a man who believed himself betrayed not by circumstance, but by blood. My mother leapt from her chair, her composure shattered. She screamed over his words, her voice shrill and piercing. "Selfish, ungrateful, after all we've done for you, after all we've given you. This is how you repay us. Do you think love will keep you safe when the world comes crashing down? You are blind, Caroline, blind and foolish." Her hands trembled as she pointed at me, her voice breaking into hysterical sobs. "If you walk this path, do not think you will walk it as our daughter. You will be nothing to us. Do you hear me? Nothing. We will cut you off, disown you completely, and when that man of yours abandons you, don't come crawling back. You will have no home, no family, no inheritance." I stood my ground. Though every word struck like a lash, my chest ached, but my resolve did not waver. "If love costs me the fortune of this family," I said evenly, "then so be it. I would rather be poor with Daniel than rich in chains." For a heartbeat, the room was silent, stunned by the defiance they had never expected me to voice aloud. Then my father's voice cut through the air, colder now, controlled and lethal. "Enough," he said, and the calmness in his tone was more frightening than his earlier rage. He pushed back his chair and stood towering over the table. His gaze locked onto mine, stripped of pretense of any lingering facade of paternal affection. "You think this is only about you, Caroline? But it is bigger than that. We have already signed preliminary agreements with Jonathan. Business contracts, partnerships, investments tied directly to this marriage. Your refusal doesn't just insult us, it costs this family millions in opportunities, in alliances, in reputation. Do you understand what you are destroying?" My throat tightened, but I managed to answer. "I understand that my life is not a bargaining chip." His eyes narrowed, his jaw set like stone. He leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper that carried more threat than any shout. "You will regret this rebellion. Every choice has a price, and you have no idea how high this one will be." The relatives sat in stunned silence, Jonathan still kneeling awkwardly with the ring clutched in his hand, his confident mask faltering. My mother wept openly now, clutching her napkin like a lifeline, while Natalie stared at me with something that looked almost like envy mixed with fear. I stood alone, trembling but unbroken, knowing I had just declared war against the people who had raised me. Father's final threat chilled me to the bone. "Caroline, we've invested too much in this arrangement to let your childish fantasies about love destroy everything we've built." After my father's threat at the dinner table, I knew there was no going back. The battle lines were drawn, and I had chosen Daniel. We decided quietly, almost defiantly, that we would plan our wedding in secret, away from the calculating eyes of my parents. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope as we sat together in his small apartment, sketching out plans with excitement that belonged entirely to us. We whispered about flowers and music, and dreamed of a ceremony that celebrated love rather than legacy. But almost as soon as we began, obstacles rose like storm clouds. Every vendor we contacted seemed enthusiastic at first, only to call days later with apologies that they could no longer accommodate us. One florist confessed in hushed tones that my mother had appeared at her shop promising legal trouble if she dared provide arrangements for our wedding. A venue manager avoided my eyes as he explained that Edward Mercer had already paid him a visit, warning him that hosting our wedding would ruin his reputation in the city's elite circles. Each cancellation felt like a shadow moving closer, reminding me that secrecy was an illusion. Somehow my parents always knew exactly what we were planning. Daniel tried to reassure me, insisting we would find another way, but the frustration gnawed at him. His shoulders, usually relaxed, grew tense, his laughter rarer. When he returned home one afternoon with a pale face and a tight jaw, I knew something had happened. He told me his department head had called him in and informed him that his teaching position was being terminated effective immediately. No explanation, just vague remarks about budget constraints and concerns raised by reputable community members. I did not need to ask who those members were. My father's reach into business and education ran deep, and the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Daniel's voice shook as he spoke, not with fear for himself, but with shame that I had been dragged into this. He hated feeling powerless, hated that my parents had stripped him of the work he loved, but all I could think was how far they were willing to go. It wasn't enough to control me. They had to dismantle him piece by piece until he no longer felt worthy of standing beside me. My mother played her role in equal measure, weaving lies through her social circle with the same skill she once used to host charity galas. I overheard whispers at a gallery opening, women lowering their voices as they speculated about Daniel. They said he was a fortune hunter, a manipulator who had spotted an easy target in the Mercer daughter desperate for affection. Vivian had painted me as naive, innocent, incapable of seeing that I was being used. The venom of her narrative was that it sounded believable to those who wanted to believe it. People I had known for years began treating me with thinly veiled pity. Their smiles strained, their conversations stilted. My world shrank, as reputations that once gave me comfort now turned to daggers aimed at Daniel. And then Jonathan returned not as a rejected suitor licking his wounds, but as a collaborator in my parents' campaign. He had money connections and a vindictive streak sharpened by my refusal. With my parents' blessing, he set about making Daniel's life unbearable. It began with small things, the sense of being watched as we walked down the street, the same car idling too long outside his apartment. Then came the men in plain clothes asking questions at his workplace, questions that always circled back to me to whether Daniel intended to profit from marrying into the Mercer family. We laughed it off at first, trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, but laughter died quickly when the harassment grew relentless. Daniel's landlord eventually called him in his face, twisted with guilt. He told Daniel he had no choice but to terminate the lease, though rent had always been paid on time. The reason he admitted was financial pressure he could not resist. "Your father-in-law paid me triple rent to evict you," he said, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. When Daniel told me, his voice carried both anger and despair, and in that moment the truth slammed into me with terrifying clarity. My parents would stop at nothing. They would ruin reputations, steal livelihoods, and dismantle the life of the man I loved, simply to maintain their control. When Daniel's landlord apologetically admitted, "Your father-in-law paid me triple rent to evict him," I realized my parents would destroy anyone I loved to maintain control. After Daniel was forced from his apartment, I felt the ground beneath me slipping away. Every corner of our lives seemed invaded, every attempt at joy poisoned by my parents' reach. It was in that atmosphere of suffocating tension that they extended one last invitation delivered with voices smooth as silk and eyes sharp as knives. They insisted we meet for a final family dinner, their words carrying the pretense of reconciliation. Against my instincts, I agreed not because I believed them, but because a part of me still clung to the faintest hope that reason might prevail. I wanted to believe that somewhere behind their cruelty lingered the parents I had longed for as a child. The restaurant was private, one of my father's favored establishments, where the staff deferred to him as though he owned the very walls. The table was set for 4, gleaming with crystal and silver polished to perfection. Jonathan sat at my mother's right hand, as though he had already replaced me as her chosen companion, while my father presided with his usual gravity. From the moment I arrived, I felt the trap closing. Their smiles were too fixed, their gestures too orchestrated like actors in a play rehearsed for my benefit. Conversation began politely with talk of family legacy and shared futures, but beneath the surface lay an undercurrent of pressure I could not ignore. My father spoke of compromise, of how surely I could see the wisdom of a union that secured not only wealth, but stability. My mother leaned close, her voice laced with practiced concern, telling me that love fades, but obligations endure, and that in time I would thank them. I barely touched the food, my appetite smothered by dread. When dessert was served, my mother herself poured me a glass of wine. Her hand was steady, her eyes meeting mine with the kind of intensity that demanded trust. She raised her glass first, smiling with false warmth, and I felt compelled to follow. The wine was rich, heavy on the tongue, and I forced it down though my body recoiled. Within minutes, the edges of the room blurred. My limbs grew heavy, my thoughts sluggish as though a fog had seeped into my blood. I remembered Jonathan's face, his smile curving with satisfaction and my mother's hand brushing mine in a gesture meant to soothe, but that felt like ownership. Then the world tilted sideways and went black. When I awoke, the room was unfamiliar. I blinked against the haze clouding my mind and realized I was back in my hotel suite. At first, I thought I had dreamed it all, but then I saw the state of the room. My wedding dress lay in shreds across the floor, pieces of satin scattered like the aftermath of violence. Across the wall, scrawled in thick red paint, were words that made my blood run cold. "Don't marry him." The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's loops and slants were carved into every letter, a signature of betrayal. I stumbled to the mirror, gripping the edge of the dresser for balance, my reflection pale and drawn. My head pounded as fragments of memory pieced themselves together. I fumbled for the phone, dialing the front desk, demanding to know how anyone had entered my room. The security guard's voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. He explained that my father had signed the visitor log himself, presenting his emergency contact status as justification. He had told them he needed to check on me for my own safety. They had let him in without question. I sank onto the bed, the shredded fabric cutting into my skin as I pressed my hands to my face. Every defense I had clung to, every shred of trust I had nurtured disintegrated in that moment. My parents had not simply disapproved or interfered. They had drugged me, violated my space, desecrated the very symbol of the future I had chosen for myself. The phone rang shrill and sharp in the silence. I lifted the receiver with trembling fingers. My mother's voice slid through the line, smooth and cold. "Better your dress ruined than your life destroyed by marrying that nobody," she said. There was no hesitation, no shame. Only the certainty of a woman who believed her cruelty was love. "We did this because we love you, even if you can't see it now." Her words struck harder than any slap, erasing the last fragile remnants of the daughter who wanted to believe her parents cared for her happiness. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. She continued, her tone like ice. "You think you know what's best for you, Caroline, but you don't. We had to act. You left us no choice." My hand shook so violently I thought I might drop the phone, but I pressed it tighter to my ear, forcing myself to absorb the truth. Mother's voice on the phone was ice cold. "We drugged you because reasoning failed. Caroline, tomorrow you'll thank us for saving you from your own stupidity." I sat on the bed, staring at the receiver, long after my mother's voice had gone silent, the words echoing in my skull like a cruel refrain. They had drugged me, destroyed my dress, invaded my room, and still spoke of it as though it were an act of love. The betrayal had hollowed something inside me, but as the shock began to dull, questions rose to fill the space. I could not shake the feeling that my parents were being driven by more than greed alone. Their desperation felt orchestrated, their certainty too rehearsed. When I confided these doubts to Harold Klein, the family's old attorney who had always shown me quiet kindness, he gave me a long look before speaking. "Caroline," he said, "your parents have not been acting on their own. They've been listening to someone else. A woman named Vivian." The name hit me like a faint echo of memory. Vivian. I had heard it whispered years ago when I was still a child, always in hushed tones when Beatrice entered the room. She had been my grandmother's partner in business, sharp-witted and ambitious, until something fractured their alliance. Beatrice never spoke of her directly, only warning me once that some people mistake power for legacy and will destroy both in the pursuit of it. I never thought that shadow from my grandmother's past would find its way into my present, but now it was clear. I pressed Harold for details, and he admitted he had long suspected Vivian's influence. My parents had begun consulting her under the guise of financial advice months earlier, believing her to be a trusted veteran of Beatrice's old circle. She had flattered them, confirmed their worst fears, and promised them a future of prosperity if only they followed her counsel. It was Vivian, not Edward or Vivian, who had first raised the idea that my independence was a threat to the family. She had told them that a daughter who thought for herself could ruin everything they had worked to preserve, that Daniel represented a danger not because of who he was, but because of what he inspired in me. Independence. Defiance. Love without transaction. The more I learned, the clearer the pattern became. For months, Vivian had been whispering poison into their ears, twisting every act of mine into evidence of recklessness. If I pushed back against their plans, she called it rebellion. If I stood by Daniel, she called it naivete. Slowly, she had painted me as the weak link, the liability, the daughter who must be corrected before she brought ruin to the Mercer name. My parents had always been vulnerable to manipulation, desperate for affirmation from anyone who promised them wealth and standing, and Vivian had offered both in exchange for their obedience. I needed proof, not just suspicions, and Harold helped me dig. What we uncovered over the following days made my stomach turn. Jonathan's luxurious lifestyle, which I had once assumed was funded by his own ventures, had in fact been sustained by a steady stream of money originating from accounts connected to Vivian. Business trips, new offices, expensive gifts, all of it traced back to her. She had been bankrolling him while grooming him to play the role of my future husband, ensuring he looked successful enough to entice my parents and secure their compliance. It explained the confidence with which he carried himself, the certainty that he could wait me out. He was not standing alone. He was a puppet, and Vivian held the strings. One afternoon, Harold spread the documents across his desk for me to see. Wire transfers, falsified invoices, accounts, and names I recognized from my parents' closest associates. At the center of it all was Vivian's signature, carefully disguised but undeniable once the threads were pulled together. "She's been using your parents as her instruments," Harold said quietly. "Convincing them they're protecting the family, when in truth they're serving her vendetta." I asked him what grudge could drive a woman to orchestrate something so insidious. His answer chilled me. Beatrice ended their partnership decades ago after discovering Vivian had siphoned funds from their company. She was cut out disgraced, but she never let it go. This is her revenge. And you, Caroline, are her means to deliver it. I thought back to my grandmother's words about the diamond dress, about secrets hidden in its seams that could one day save me. She had known Vivian was dangerous. She had anticipated that the old wound would one day bleed into the next generation. And now here I was living in the middle of a scheme designed not only to strip me of my choices, but to turn my own parents into accomplices against me. It was almost unbearable to accept that their betrayal had not been entirely their own design, but the evidence was irrefutable. I left Harold's office carrying copies of the bank records, my hands trembling as I studied them under the dim light of my hotel room. Each page told the same story in black and white money-funneled alliances forged my parents' signatures following Vivian's lead. They had not only betrayed me for money, they had been manipulated into betraying me by someone who had hated our family long before I was born. The bank records revealed a horrifying truth. My parents hadn't just betrayed me for money, they'd been manipulated into betraying me by someone with a decades-old grudge against our family. The discovery of Vivian's hand in my parents' betrayal had left me shaken, but Harold Klein insisted that the truth I had seen so far was only part of what Beatrice had prepared for me. A week later, he arrived at my hotel carrying a small locked box and an envelope embossed with my grandmother's seal. His face was grave as he placed them on the table between us. "This was entrusted to me after Beatrice's death," he explained. "Her will instructed that it be delivered to you when the time came when you needed it most. After what you've endured, I believe that time is now." My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. The letter inside was written in Beatrice's elegant hand, the same steady script I remembered from birthday cards and notes slipped into my schoolbooks. But the tone was unlike anything I had ever read from her. It was not warm or nostalgic, but deliberate, as though every word was chosen to serve as a weapon. She wrote that she had known Edward and Vivian would one day sacrifice me for their financial gain. She had seen their ambition harden into obsession, had heard the way they spoke of me as an asset to be traded rather than a child to be loved. Knowing this, she had taken steps to arm me against their inevitable betrayal. The box contained instructions for locating compartments hidden within the seams of the diamond dress. She explained that she had chosen the dress deliberately, a garment my mother coveted, but never understood because she knew its beauty would ensure its survival. Within the lining, she had concealed documents, copies of ledgers and statements that revealed years of embezzlement from the Mercer family trusts. She wrote of charities drained for private luxuries, funds diverted to prop up failing ventures, and accounts falsified to disguise the theft. She described in painful detail how Edward and Vivian had built their lavish lifestyle not on success, but on stolen money, and how they intended to use my arranged marriage to Jonathan to launder and stabilize the fortune. I felt sick as I read the words burning into me with every line. My parents' cruelty toward me had always been framed as discipline control, even misguided love. But here was proof that their betrayal stretched far beyond my life. They had stolen from institutions meant to help others, from funds meant to sustain the very legacy they claimed to protect. They had not only planned to barter me for security, but had already been living as thieves for years. Beatrice did not spare me from the ugliness. They lost their souls to greed. Long ago, she wrote. There is no redemption left for them, only consequences. These documents are your shield, Caroline. They are the truth you will need when they try to sell your happiness for their security. Guard them well, for they carry the power to protect you and the power to destroy them. I unfolded each page with mounting dread, scanning the evidence she had assembled with meticulous care. There were bank statements showing withdrawals that matched suspicious deposits in offshore accounts, receipts for extravagant purchases, written off as business expenses correspondence that revealed coordination between my parents and their allies in the scheme. The weight of the proof was undeniable. Anyone who saw these records would know that Edward and Vivian were not victims of circumstance or misguided parents, but criminals who had built their empire on lies. My throat tightened as I reached the final pages of her letter. Beatrice acknowledged the pain she knew I would feel reading her words, the shattering of illusions that even she admitted she had once wanted to preserve for my sake. But she reminded me that survival required truth, not comfort. "You must decide what to do with this evidence," she wrote. "You may use it to free yourself from their grasp, or you may choose to bury it and remain their prisoner. But know this, my dear, the dress is more than a garment. It is the vessel of truth I created for you, the proof of everything they are and everything they have done. When the moment comes, you will know how to wield it." Tears blurred my vision not only for the crime she revealed, but for the foresight and love it must have taken to prepare this for me. Beatrice had known her son and daughter-in-law would one day turn on me, and rather than despair, she had armed me with the very weapon that could undo them. I clutched the letter to my chest, the words searing themselves into me like a vow. Beatrice's letter ended with a devastating revelation. "Your parents have been stealing from your inheritance for years, Caroline. The diamond dress contains proof that will either save you or destroy them." The weight of Beatrice's letter still pressed against me as though her hand itself had delivered the warning. I folded the pages carefully and locked them away, telling myself they were a shield I could wield when the time came. But I had little chance to breathe before the storm broke again. That evening I returned to my hotel suite and found the air already occupied. My parents sat stiffly in the armchairs by the window, Jonathan lounging with his usual smugness at the desk. The sight of the three of them together, united and uninvited, made my stomach tighten. I closed the door slowly behind me, refusing to show them my shock. My father stood first, his voice clipped and commanding. "Caroline, enough games. We know you still have the dress, and you will hand it over tonight. You will put an end to this rebellion and do what is required of you." His words were not a request, but a sentence delivered. My mother's eyes glistened as she leaned forward, clutching a tissue. Her face painted with a sorrow that would have moved anyone who did not know her as I did. "We didn't want to come to this," she said, her tone trembling. "But you've left us no choice. We've made commitments Caroline promises to Jonathan's partners. Do you understand men who have invested money and reputation based on the union we told them was certain? If you refuse, those agreements collapse. The family will face financial ruin and worse criminal charges. We'll all go down together." I stared at her, unable to reconcile the tears sliding down her cheeks with the cruelty of her words. She was not weeping for me, not even for herself, but for the empire she feared would crumble without selling me to secure it. Jonathan rose, then straightening his tie with deliberate ease. "They're right, Caroline. You've been reckless, but this can be salvaged if you accept what is inevitable. You marry me, the family survives, and this embarrassing chapter disappears." His confidence was unbearable, as though he believed he had already won. I turned to my father, hoping for even a flicker of humanity, but his expression was carved from stone. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, and what he said next drove the air from my lungs. "Daniel has already been taken care of. He was arrested this afternoon on charges of stalking and harassment. The evidence is in place, the witnesses ready. He will remain behind bars until you do the right thing." My body went cold, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might break free from my chest. I whispered that it wasn't possible, that Daniel would never be capable of such things, but Jonathan only smirked, and my father's eyes narrowed. Vivian dabbed at her eyes and pressed on her voice, rising with urgency. "Think of what you're doing to us. Think of your sister, of the family name. This isn't just about you anymore. You can't sacrifice everyone for some childish fantasy of love. We raised you better than this." Her plea might have sounded maternal to anyone else, but to me it was just another blade slipped between my ribs. I demanded to know if they had truly fabricated charges against Daniel, praying it was a bluff. My father's silence was worse than an answer. The way he held my gaze unblinking was confirmation enough. Rage flared in me, but it was crushed by a wave of helplessness. They had not only poisoned my reputation and destroyed my trust, but now they had caged the man I loved, using him as leverage to bind me to their scheme. I felt the walls of the suite closing in their voices, weaving together into a net meant to ensnare me until I could no longer distinguish one threat from another. I clenched my fists to keep them from trembling, forcing myself to stand tall though my knees wanted to give way. The dress in the locked trunk felt heavier than ever, a secret they suspected, but did not yet know how to reach. I thought of Beatrice's words of her faith, that I would know how to wield the truth when the moment arrived, and clung to that as my only anchor. But in that room facing the three of them, I could not yet reveal what I held. My parents' desperation had reached its peak, and they were prepared to destroy Daniel completely if I defied them. Edward's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and final. He stepped so close I could see the pulse in his temple, his tone a low growl. "Choose now, Caroline. Marry Jonathan, and Daniel goes free, or continue this rebellion and watch the man you love rot in prison." The threat my father had delivered still echoed in my mind when Natalie came to me. I had expected her to side fully with them as she always had, slipping easily into the role of the dutiful daughter while I was cast as the rebellious one. So when she appeared at my hotel suite late one evening, her face pale and her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse, I felt both suspicion and dread. She asked if she could come in, her voice low, almost ashamed. I let her, though every instinct told me I was inviting in more pain. She stood in the center of the room, glancing around as though she feared our parents had hidden eyes in the corners, and then she blurted out the words that made my breath catch. "I knew," she said, her voice cracking. "I knew they were going to drug you that night." My chest tightened, rage and sorrow warring inside me. I demanded to know how she could possibly stay silent, how she could let me walk into that trap without lifting a finger. She twisted her hands together, tears pooling in her eyes. "They told me it was for your own good. That you were blinded by love, that Daniel was dangerous to the family, and that the only way to protect you was to make you see reason." I wanted to believe them. I've spent my whole life wanting to believe them. She sank into a chair, her composure unraveling. "They promised me everything I thought I'd never have. They said if I supported them, if I stayed quiet, I would inherit the business. For once, I wouldn't be the forgotten daughter. I would be the one who mattered." Her words cut me in ways my parents' cruelty never had, because they carried the weight of sisterhood twisted by jealousy and desperation. I remembered the endless comparisons, the way my successes were dismissed while hers were magnified, and how even then she seemed to crave more. She admitted that when our parents laid out their plan to secure my marriage to Jonathan, she felt a twisted satisfaction. For once, she would not be the one overlooked. For once, she would be rewarded for loyalty. I told myself it was just a sleeping pill, she whispered. That it wasn't really harming you, that you would wake up and finally see sense. I wanted to believe that. But when I saw you unconscious, when I realized they had ripped apart your dress and written that message like some horror story, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Her voice broke then, and she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to lash out to tell her she was complicit, that her silence had made her part of their cruelty. Yet as I watched her trembling and undone, I also saw something unfamiliar in her shame. Real raw shame. She confessed that since that night she had begun to keep records. Every conversation, every underhanded deal, every threat, they were all written down, some even recorded secretly. She said she didn't know what she would do with them, only that she needed something to protect herself if our parents ever turned their wrath toward her. "I've seen how far they're willing to go," she said, her eyes searching mine, "and I'm starting to realize that if they can do it to you, they can do it to me too." The words settled heavily between us. I realized then that Natalie was both victim and accomplice, caught in the same web but bound by different strands. Her jealousy had made her pliable, her longing for approval their perfect weapon. But she was also beginning to see what I had long known, that Edward and Vivian cared for nothing and no one beyond their own power. She reached for my hand tentatively, her grip weak but sincere. "I don't expect forgiveness," she murmured. "I just couldn't keep carrying it alone. I thought I wanted everything you had, but now I see what it cost you. And I can't live like this anymore." I looked at her, my heart torn. She was my sister, the girl I had shared a childhood with, the only other person who knew the intricacies of our parents' household. And yet she had stood by while they poisoned me, tempted by the hollow promise of recognition. The betrayal and the confession twisted together inside me until I could no longer separate them. My voice shook as I told her that the damage was done, that her silence had nearly broken me, but that I understood the hunger she had felt. It was the same hunger I had once carried, the need for our parents to see me, to value me. We had both been children, starving at the same table, one fed with false praise, the other left with scraps of scorn. Natalie's tears fell silently as she whispered the words that will forever echo in my memory. "Caroline, I wanted what you had so badly that I helped them drug you. And now I can't live with what we've become." The night of Natalie's confession left me shaken but also strangely fortified. If even she who had once reveled in their approval could see the monstrosity of what our parents had become, then I was no longer just a rebellious daughter fighting shadows. I was someone carrying the weight of truth, and I knew the moment had arrived to wield it. When the day of my wedding finally came, I stood before the mirror in my suite, my hands smoothing over the gown that shimmered like liquid starlight. The diamond dress was no longer just fabric and jewels. It was armor, the vessel of my grandmother's foresight, and the vault for the evidence of every crime Edward and Vivian had committed. As I looked at myself, I felt her presence guiding me, reminding me that courage meant choosing love even in the face of tyranny. When I walked into the chapel, the air seemed to shift. Conversations hushed, eyes turned, and gasps broke the silence like fragile glass shattering. The diamonds embedded in the gown caught the light and cast fragments across the walls, each glimmer like a shard of truth slicing through the carefully cultivated illusions my parents had spun. I caught the flicker of horror in my father's eyes, the tremor in my mother's lips as recognition dawned. They knew what this dress meant. They knew what was hidden in its seams. And in that moment, the control they had so carefully guarded began to unravel. Daniel stood at the altar, waiting, his face filled not with fear, but with love so steady it anchored me. I took each step with deliberate calm, though my heart raced with the weight of what I carried. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering, confusion rippling through the room. My parents' allies and Jonathan's backers had gathered, expecting a performance of unity, a final act of submission. Instead, they were witnessing rebellion dressed in brilliance. I reached the altar and turned to face the assembled crowd, my voice steady, though my hands trembled beneath the bouquet I held. "This dress," I said, my words carrying across the room, "represents the difference between a family built on love and one built on greed and manipulation. Today, I choose love." For a moment, silence held, the kind that precedes a storm. Then a murmur spread, shocked voices rising, the sound of reputations cracking as the truth hinted its presence in every sparkling seam of the gown. I caught sight of Jonathan, his confident mask slipping, his fists clenched as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. My mother leaned toward my father, whispering urgently, her knuckles white as she gripped the arm of her chair. Edward's face hardened, his fury contained only by the presence of witnesses. He could not drag me away, not here, not now, not when the diamonds glittered like an unspoken threat that everything he had hidden could spill into the open. The officiant, flustered but bound to his duty, resumed the ceremony. I felt Daniel's hand slip into mine, warm and reassuring, and together we spoke our vows. My voice did not falter. Each word was a declaration not only of love, but of defiance, a promise to stand with him, even as the empire of lies behind me trembled. Daniel's vow was simple and unadorned, but the sincerity in his tone made my eyes sting with tears. He did not see me as an asset, a contract, or a pawn. He saw me as Caroline, and in his eyes I finally felt like more than the sum of my parents' schemes. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, I lifted my gaze toward my parents. My mother's hands trembled against her lap, her eyes wide with panic. My father's jaw was set, his expression carved from ice, But beneath the stoicism, I saw the glint of fear. They could not tear the dress from me without tearing away their own last veil of respectability. They could not stop the vows without revealing the depths of their desperation. They were trapped just as they had always sought to trap me. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the room erupted in applause, though beneath the cheers lingered a tension thick as storm clouds. I turned to Daniel, and as our lips met, the world seemed to hold its breath. But I did not look only at him. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Edward and Vivian frozen their faces, pale, their future crumbling before them. The terror in their eyes was unmistakable, a silent acknowledgement that the daughter they had tried to break now carried both the evidence of their corruption and the strength to reveal it. As I kissed Daniel, I could see the terror in my parents' eyes as they realized their greatest fear had come true. I had both the evidence and the courage to destroy them. The applause from our wedding still echoed in my memory like a hymn of defiance, but the days that followed unfolded with surprising calm. Daniel and I settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, almost safe. We spent our mornings sharing coffee on the balcony of our modest apartment, the sunlight spilling across the table as though blessing our union. For the first time in years, I felt free to laugh without weighing the cost. We walked hand in hand through the park, spoke about the future with unguarded optimism, and even began to dream of a home where the past would not reach us. For a fleeting span of weeks, I allowed myself to believe the storm had passed. My parents remained silent, offering no new schemes or confrontations. Invitations to their house stopped arriving, their names disappeared from my phone, and for the first time their absence felt like a gift. Yet beneath that silence, unease stirred. Silence had never been Edward and Vivian's way. They thrived on control, and surrender was not in their nature. It was Daniel who first noticed the subtle signs. He read the financial pages with the same attentiveness he brought to his history lectures, and one evening he pointed out unusual movements tied to Mercer Holdings. "They're selling off assets," he said, tracing the columns with his finger, "transferring money overseas. These aren't the actions of people who've accepted defeat." I felt a cold shiver run through me as I considered what it meant. They were preparing for flight, preparing for the possibility that I might expose the truth locked within the seams of my dress. Rather than face justice, they would run, taking with them whatever pieces of the fortune they could salvage. Still in public, they played the part of dignified parents maintaining dignity after a family rift. At charity events and social gatherings, they smiled for photographs and spoke warmly of their daughters as though nothing had fractured us. Their allies whispered about reconciliation, and I overheard strangers comment that the Mercers were handling things with grace. It was a mask carefully crafted, and many believed it. But I had seen the faces behind it, the desperation that lurked in every calculated glance, and I knew better than to mistake performance for peace. Then the messages began. At first, they arrived as subtle warnings, typed notes tucked under our door, or slipped into my handbag when I wasn't looking. The handwriting varied, the language vague, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Keep family matters private. Do not humiliate us. Stop now before it's too late." I tried to brush them off as scare tactics, reminders of my parents' reach, but they grew more pointed with each passing week. Daniel urged me to take them seriously, to strengthen locks and remain vigilant, but I hated the way fear began creeping back into our daily lives. We had just begun to live freely, and already shadows were crowding our doorway. One evening I returned home to find Daniel pale, holding a folded sheet of paper that had been pushed beneath the door while I was out. He handed it to me without a word, his eyes troubled. I unfolded it, expecting another veiled warning, but the sight of the stationery made my breath catch. It was my mother's cream-colored with a delicate embossed crest I had seen on countless family letters. The words scrawled across it were not vague this time. They were chilling in their bluntness. "Some secrets are worth killing to protect Caroline." The letters swam before my eyes, and I felt the world tilt. It was not an idle threat written by a distant enemy. It was a promise penned on paper that belonged unmistakably to Vivian Mercer. I clutched the note, my pulse hammering as Daniel's arm came around me. The fragile peace of our first weeks together shattered in an instant, replaced by the certainty that my parents were not finished, that their silence had only been the prelude to something darker. The anonymous note slipped under our door was written on my mother's personal stationery. "Some secrets are worth killing to protect Caroline." The note on my mother's stationery lingered in my thoughts like a poison that would not leave my veins. Even as Daniel tried to comfort me, even as I reminded myself of the truth we held in the diamond dress, I could not shake the sense that the quiet was only a mask for their next strike. I was right. It came not as violence, but as something more insidious, something designed to carve open my trust and make me bleed from within. A few weeks after the letter appeared, my mother arrived at my hotel without warning. She looked different from the last time I had seen her. Her face drawn, her eyes shadowed, her voice thick with a tremor that seemed almost too convincing. She carried a folder pressed to her chest, as though it weighed as much as her grief. I let her in. Reluctantly, my guard raised, but she wasted no time in opening the folder and laying its contents on the table between us. Photographs slid into view, glossy prints that caught the light with cruel precision. They showed Daniel in places I did not recognize, in restaurants with women I had never met. His posture too familiar, his smile too intimate. My stomach knotted as I stared at the images, my heart screaming against my mind. She pushed them toward me gently, her hand trembling as though she could barely stand to look. "I didn't want to believe it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I had to be sure. I hired someone to find out, and this is what they discovered." I shook my head, refusing to accept what I saw. "This isn't real," I said, my voice sharp. But the photos were detailed, the angles convincing, and the weight of my history with betrayal pressed down like a lead cloak. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers with practiced tenderness. "Sweetheart, I wish I were wrong. I would give anything to be wrong. But I've lived long enough to recognize the signs. He's deceiving you. I'm so sorry you had to learn it this way." Tears pricked my eyes despite my resolve. The images burned into me, colliding with every wound my parents had inflicted before. Could it be true? Had Daniel betrayed me, the one person I had believed would never turn away? My mother leaned closer, her eyes shining with sorrow that looked achingly real. "You've already suffered so much because of us," she said softly. "I prayed he would be different, that you had finally found someone worthy of you. But I can't stand by and watch him use you." The words hit their mark. I felt my certainty waver, my trust tremble under the weight of years of manipulation. She knew exactly where to strike at my deepest fear, that everyone I loved would eventually choose greed or power over me. She left the folder on the table when she rose to go, her figure framed in the doorway like a grieving guardian. "Please think about what you've seen," she murmured. "I'll support whatever choice you make, but I couldn't forgive myself if I stayed silent." After she left, I sat frozen, staring at the photographs until the edges blurred. Doubt seeped into me like water into cracked stone, spreading, eroding. When Daniel returned that night, his smile fading at the sight of my tears, I could not meet his eyes. I asked him where he had been on certain nights, my voice trembling, and the hurt on his face nearly undid me. He swore he had never strayed, that he loved me and only me. But the images sat between us, sharp and accusing. Sleep abandoned me that night. I lay awake, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for cracks I had missed, for signs that my mother's words carried truth. But with every doubt came the memory of Daniel's unwavering support, his refusal to abandon me, even when bribed, his loyalty tested by threats, and yet unbroken. Slowly, painfully, I realized the cruelty of what was happening. My parents had planted this poison. They had created it with intention, fabricating evidence and disguising their malice as maternal concern. The next morning I studied the photographs again, this time with a clearer head. Something about them was wrong. The lighting in one was inconsistent, Daniel's shadow falling at an angle that didn't match the rest of the scene. Another showed him with a glass of wine in his hand, though I knew he never drank. The more I looked, the more I saw the subtle signs of manipulation, but the seed of doubt had already been planted, and rooting it out would not be easy. When I confronted my mother later, desperate for some crack in her facade, she only wept harder, pressing her hands to her face as if consumed by grief. Caroline, sweetheart, I hate being right about Daniel, but a mother knows when her daughter is being deceived. The photographs my mother had left behind were still on the table when the next blow came. Daniel and I tried to push forward to cling to the vows we had spoken and the strength we drew from each other, but the enemy we faced never slept. One morning, Daniel returned from the bank with a look of alarm etched across his face. Our accounts had been frozen, the teller telling him that suspicious activity had triggered internal review. At first, I thought it must be a mistake, some bureaucratic tangle that could be unraveled with a few phone calls, but as the hours passed, more pieces of the trap revealed themselves. Transactions we had never made appeared on our statements. Large withdrawals, authorized with forged signatures, payments routed to accounts we had never heard of. Every attempt to correct the record was met with polite stonewalling, and behind the courtesy, I could feel my father's hand. His network in the banking world was vast, his influence unquestioned, and he had turned it against his own daughter without hesitation. The consequences were immediate and suffocating. Bills went unpaid, automatic drafts bounced, and our modest savings dwindled to nothing. Daniel tried to hide his worry from me, but I could see the way his shoulders slumped when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he stared at the ceiling at night, as though calculating how long we could endure. Then, as though choreographed, my mother appeared at my door, her face arranged in the mask of compassion she wore when she wanted to disguise cruelty as care. She sat across from me, took my hand in hers, and spoke in a voice so tender it might have fooled anyone else. Caroline, none of this has to continue. You're suffering because you're resisting the path that was meant for you. If you agree to annul this mistake of a marriage and do what's right, everything will be restored. Your accounts, your future, even a generous inheritance beyond what you ever expected. Jonathan is still willing. All you need to do is accept. Her words dripped with false kindness, but beneath them lay the same chains they had always tried to place around my wrists. I pulled my hand free, asking her how she could sit there and pretend to be a mother while dangling money in exchange for my heart. Her expression hardened for only a moment before softening again into mock sorrow. I only want what's best for you, even if you can't see it yet. Daniel cannot protect you. He cannot provide for you. He is dragging you down into ruin, and when you finally understand, it will be too late. She left soon after, her perfume lingering like smoke, the promise of her offer echoing in the silence. I tried to reassure Daniel that we would endure, that money could be lost and rebuilt, but he had begun to face attacks of his own. Letters arrived from universities where he had applied for teaching positions, each one a rejection cloaked in vague excuses. Friends whispered of rumors circulating in professional circles, claims that he was unreliable, unstable, even dangerous. It was clear that his reputation was being systematically dismantled, and when we traced the threads, they led inevitably back to Vivian. With her connections in the academic world and her talent for manipulation, she had orchestrated his blacklisting. Schools that had once courted him now treated his name like poison, closing every door before he could even knock. The weight of it pressed on us from every side. With our finances crippled and his career sabotaged, we lived under constant strain, each day another test of endurance. Yet through it all, Daniel remained steadfast, refusing to abandon me, even when the future looked bleak. His loyalty only deepened my resolve, but it also sharpened the fear that my parents would never stop until they had broken us completely. It was my father who delivered the final blow of that chapter. He summoned me to his office under the guise of discussion, the place where as a child I had once watched him sign contracts with the same hand that later struck down my choices. He greeted me with a smile so cold it barely qualified as human a smile, that told me he believed victory was inevitable. He gestured for me to sit and slid a folder across the desk. Inside were more documents detailing the supposed fraudulent activity on our accounts papers, crafted with such precision that anyone who didn't know the truth would believe them authentic. He watched me scan the pages, his expression one of quiet triumph. Then he leaned back, steepling his fingers, his voice soft but razor-sharp. "Caroline, we can solve your financial problems instantly, or we can make them so much worse. Choose wisely." I left my father's office that day with the sound of his threat still hanging in the air. His cold smile etched into my memory like a scar. The weight of his ultimatum pressed on me, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I returned to my hotel exhausted, expecting only silence, but instead, I found Natalie waiting for me in the lobby. She looked restless, her eyes darting as though she feared being followed. When she saw me, she hurried over and whispered urgently that we needed to talk somewhere private. I led her upstairs, suspicion gnawing at me, unsure whether she had come as an ally or another messenger for our parents. In the quiet of my suite, she paced before finally blurting out words that froze me in place. "Caroline, it's worse than you think. They're not just trying to ruin your marriage or your finances. They're planning to have you declared incompetent." I stared at her, unable to speak at first, until the meaning sank in. She explained in halting tones that Edward and Vivian had been meeting with lawyers and doctors, weaving a narrative of my supposed instability. They were gathering testimonies, building files, and preparing petitions that would strip me of my autonomy. According to them, my refusal to accept Jonathan and my marriage to Daniel were proof enough that I was incapable of rational judgment. The words struck like blows. I had endured sabotage threats and betrayal, but the idea that my own parents would attempt to erase my sanity in the eyes of the law was something I had never imagined. Natalie's voice shook as she continued. "They've been discussing commitment papers. I overheard them talking with a psychiatrist they've bribed to testify that you're suffering from delusions and impaired judgment. They said once you're institutionalized, it will be easy to have control of your inheritance transferred back into their hands." I felt the air leave my lungs. Every move I had made to free myself from their control, every act of defiance was now being twisted into evidence against me. I asked her how she could possibly know all of this, and she lowered her eyes before answering. "Because they trusted me. They promised me control of the business if I stayed loyal, if I helped them force you into the marriage. I wanted to believe them, Caroline. I wanted so badly to finally matter to them that I ignored how far they were going. But this, I can't ignore." Her voice broke then, and I could see how torn she was, caught between her longing for recognition and the horror of what our parents were truly planning. She confessed that she had started recording conversations, secretly saving documents, copying files. At first, it was only for her own protection, a shield in case they ever turned on her. But the more she gathered, the clearer it became that she had been complicit in something monstrous. "I thought I wanted the power they dangled in front of me," she admitted. "But what good is power if it means helping them destroy my sister?" I watched her struggle with the words, and for the first time, I saw her not as the rival who had always basked in their approval, but as another daughter trapped in the same cruel web. She had chosen differently for too long, but now she was standing in front of me, trembling with the weight of the truth she could no longer keep to herself. I wanted to be angry, to accuse her of betrayal, but I also knew what it meant for her to turn against them, to risk losing the only form of validation she had ever known. When she finally pulled a folded packet from her bag, her hands shook so violently that the papers rattled. She laid them on the table before me, her face pale. "These are drafts of the documents," she said. "I took them when no one was looking. They're planning to have you committed to a psychiatric facility. They think once you're inside, you'll have no choice but to sign away everything. Your marriage, your inheritance, even your freedom. And they won't let you out until you agree to marry Jonathan." I picked up the papers with trembling hands, the legal language stark and merciless. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but the meaning was unmistakable. My parents were prepared to strip me of everything, even my sanity, to maintain control. Across the table, Natalie's eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered the confession that broke me more than the documents themselves. Caroline, I wanted what you had so badly that I helped them drug you, and now I can't live with what we've become. Natalie's trembling hands and the commitment papers she laid before me left me sleepless, my thoughts spinning with dread of what my parents might try next. I barely left the apartment, watching every shadow across the window, as though it might hold a threat. Daniel urged me to stay strong, to believe that truth would prevail, but fear clung to me like a second skin. I did not have to wait long for that fear to take shape. One afternoon, there was a pounding at the door, not the polite knock of a visitor, but the insistent hammering of people who intended to enter, whether invited or not. When I opened it, my parents stood in the hallway flanked by 2 uniformed orderlies and a stern-faced man in a suit holding a folder of papers. My mother's expression was almost serene, my father's jaw tight with determination. Edward stepped forward and handed me the folder. "This is a court order, Caroline," he said coldly. "You're coming with us for evaluation. It's for your own good." My pulse thundered as I scanned the documents. They alleged a history of erratic behavior, emotional instability, even claims of self-harm that were complete fabrications. The words swam before my eyes, every line a weapon sharpened to cut me out of my own life. I looked up in horror. "This is a lie," I whispered. My mother's face softened with practiced sorrow. "Sweetheart, you've been under such strain. We've tried everything else. This is the only way to help you." The orderlies stepped forward, their hands reaching for me with clinical detachment. Daniel rushed from the bedroom, shouting for them to stop, but Edward cut him off with a single gesture. "Interfere and you'll be charged with obstruction. Caroline needs treatment. We won't allow you to destroy yourself." His words carried the finality of a sentence already passed. My heart pounded as the orderlies gripped my arms, their strength overwhelming. I struggled, pleading, insisting I was sane, but to them, I was just another patient resisting. My mother stood watching, her eyes shining with what to others might look like grief, but to me was satisfaction. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I would be dragged into a facility and silenced until I bent to their will. Then, through the open doorway, a new voice rang out. Not another step. It was Harold Klein, his figure framed in the hall, his voice steady as iron. He strode in holding a leather case and produced documents of his own, his eyes fixed on the man in the suit. "This order is invalid," he declared. "Obtained through perjury and falsified medical reports. I have evidence here of payments made directly from Mercer accounts to the doctor who signed off on these claims." The man hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his stern mask. Harold pressed on, his tone unyielding. "If you proceed, you'll be complicit in fraud. I advise you to read this carefully before taking another action." The orderlies paused, looking to their superior for direction. The man in the suit took Harold's documents, scanning the pages with growing unease. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, until finally he closed the folder and gave a curt nod. "Stand down," he ordered. The orderlies released me at once, stepping back as though I were suddenly untouchable. Relief flooded through me, leaving my knees weak, but beneath it burned a rage fiercer than any I had felt before. My parents' expressions shifted. My father's fury was barely contained, his mouth a hard line of contempt. My mother's sorrowful mask cracked, revealing a flash of bitterness beneath. I realized then with searing clarity that they had been willing to sign away not only my freedom, but my very sanity if it meant securing their grip on the family fortune. Love had nothing to do with their actions. They had crossed a line from which there was no return, proving themselves capable of erasing me entirely, rather than accept my independence. Harold guided me toward the couch, his hand steady on my shoulder, as he told the others they were no longer welcome. The orderlies retreated first, followed by the man in the suit, leaving only my parents standing in the doorway. My father's glare promised retribution, but it was my mother's words that carved the deepest wound. As the door began to close behind them, she leaned in just enough for her voice to carry her tone stripped of all pretense. "You're not my daughter anymore, Caroline. You're just an obstacle to our survival." After my mother's words branded me an obstacle to their survival, I felt as though the last thread of protection that comes with being a daughter had been cut forever. The betrayal hollowed me out, and for days I moved through our apartment like a ghost. Daniel tried to reach me, but even his touch sometimes felt too gentle, as if it might break the fragile shell holding me together. My parents' attacks didn't pause to let me recover. Bills arrived with unexplained charges. Friends who once supported us suddenly withdrew invitations, and whispers about me circulated in the places I used to feel safe. It was as though the entire city had been enlisted in my parents' campaign to break me. Daniel carried the weight too, and I could see how much it wore him down. One evening, I found him sitting in the dark, his shoulders hunched, staring out the window at the glowing skyline. He didn't turn when I came in. "Caroline," he said, his voice tight with something between disbelief and anger. "I don't understand how people who raised you could do this. Parents are supposed to shield their children from cruelty, not invent new ways to inflict it. How do they sleep at night?" His voice cracked, and I felt the sting of tears behind my own eyes. I had no answer. I had been asking myself the same question since this nightmare began. I tried to stay strong, but the relentless pressure burrowed deep into me. Late at night when Daniel was asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every accusation my parents had thrown at me over the years: selfish, ungrateful, unstable. Their voices grew louder than my own, and I began to wonder if they were right. Perhaps I wasn't worth fighting for. Perhaps Daniel deserved someone untainted by constant battles, someone who didn't drag him through endless storms of manipulation and lies. The thought gnawed at me until one night it broke free. I collapsed onto the floor of our bedroom, sobbing so hard my body shook. When Daniel rushed to my side, I clutched his shirt and choked out the words that had been festering. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't deserve you. Maybe happiness was never meant for me." His reaction was immediate and fierce. He lifted my face in his hands, his eyes blazing with conviction. "Don't you ever say that again. You deserve every ounce of love this world has to give. You are not defined by their cruelty, Caroline. You are defined by the strength it takes to stand against it." I wanted to believe him, but the doubts were stubborn, stitched into me by years of comparison to Natalie and belittlement by Edward and Vivian. Daniel saw the hesitation in my eyes, and instead of retreating, he drew me closer. "Listen to me," he whispered. "I will stand with you until my last breath. They can throw everything they have at us, but they cannot erase what we have. I will not let them win." Those words became my lifeline in the weeks that followed. Each time I faltered, he reminded me. When I doubted my worth, he listed every way he admired me. When I feared collapse, he reminded me of the vows we spoke and the courage I had already shown. Slowly, I began to lean on him in a way I never had before, and he on me. We shared not only our fears, but our smallest victories, like the day one of his students reached out to say he had changed her life. Proof that his worth extended far beyond the lies my parents spread. Just as we were beginning to rebuild our fragile strength, Daniel revealed something that shook me to my core. We were at the kitchen table late one night, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills and rejection letters from universities that had quietly blacklisted him. He sat in silence for a long while before speaking, his voice lower than usual. "There's something I've been keeping from you," he said. "Not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't want to burden you more." Fear surged in me, but I nodded, urging him on. He took a deep breath. "Your father approached me. Alone. He said he had a proposition. If I agreed to leave you to disappear from your life forever, he would give me $1 million. Enough to start over anywhere I wanted." His words struck like lightning, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The image of my father offering such a bribe, speaking of me as though I were merchandise, made bile rise in my throat. My hands shook as I asked, "And what did you say?" Daniel's gaze never wavered. I told him no. Instantly, I told him I would never leave you, not for any sum of money. Relief surged through me, but before I could cling to it, he added the part that made my blood run cold. He didn't take it well. When I refused, he leaned closer and said, if I didn't take the offer, he'd make me disappear another way. He threatened my life, Caroline. The room spun around me. My father had not only tried to buy Daniel's absence, but had threatened to kill him when the bribe failed. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. I thought I had already seen the depth of their cruelty, but this revelation shattered even that belief. Daniel's revelation shocked me. Caroline, your father offered me $1 million to disappear from your life forever, and when I refused, he threatened to have me killed. When Daniel confessed that my father had tried to bribe and then threaten him, I thought I had finally glimpsed the bottom of how far my parents were willing to sink. But just as I convinced myself I had seen the full scope of their cruelty, Linda appeared and proved me wrong. She showed up unannounced one evening, her face pale and her movements nervous, as though she had walked through a gauntlet to reach my door. I hesitated before letting her in, unsure if she had come as a messenger for Edward and Vivian, or something else entirely. She stepped inside and stood by the window, twisting her hands together. "Caroline," she began, her voice trembling. "I've been keeping something from you, and if I don't say it now, I'll regret it forever." My stomach tightened. I braced myself for another betrayal. But then she said the words I never expected. "Your parents asked me to work for them months ago. I agreed, but not in the way they think. I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to protect you." Her admission left me stunned. She explained that Edward and Vivian had recruited her to keep tabs on me, to feed them details about my whereabouts and plans. But instead of giving them anything that would truly harm me, she had offered harmless information details about errands, casual meetings, things so trivial they could not be used against me. Meanwhile, she had been documenting what they were doing behind the scenes. I thought if I played along, she said I could buy you time. I could watch them closely and gather proof of what they were really planning. I demanded to know what she meant by proof, and Linda's expression hardened. "Your parents have been isolating you on purpose. It isn't random that friends stopped calling or that potential employers lost interest in Daniel. They paid people off, threatened others, and built a wall around you, brick by brick, until you had no one left to lean on but them. I've seen the money change hands. I've heard the conversations. They've gone to doctors, teachers, even old family friends. They want you to believe you're completely alone." Her words hit me like a blow. Memories rushed back of friendships that had withered, overnight job opportunities that evaporated, medical professionals who dismissed my concerns with condescension. I had blamed myself for years, thinking I had been the one who drove people away. To learn that it had all been orchestrated, that Edward and Vivian had engineered my loneliness, made my knees weak. Linda's voice softened. "They're not trying to guide you, Caroline. They're trying to erase every choice but theirs." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device, placing it on the table between us. I recorded them. I knew words alone wouldn't be enough, so I collected evidence. My hands shook as I pressed play. At first, there was static. Then my father's voice, crisp and businesslike, as if he were negotiating contracts rather than conspiring against his own child. He spoke of transferring funds under false pretenses of pressuring officials with bribes of inventing stories to smear Daniel's name. My mother's voice followed, weeping softly before sharpening with resolve. "If she won't bend, we'll force her. If she resists, we'll make her see reason." Each recording was worse than the last. In one, Edward detailed how much it had cost to silence a doctor willing to sign false reports about my mental health. In another, Vivian described bribing a family friend to testify that Daniel had been abusive. The casual tone with which they spoke of such monstrous acts made bile rise in my throat. These weren't desperate mistakes. They were strategies planned and executed with precision. I pressed pause, unable to listen further. My voice cracked when I asked Linda why she was showing me this now. She looked at me with something close to guilt. Because I thought I could handle it alone, that if I gathered enough proof I could stop them before they hurt you. But I can't anymore. They've gone too far, Caroline. And if you don't see the full danger, you won't be ready for what's coming. She slid another file across the table. Inside were notes she had taken, dates, places, and names. The pattern was undeniable: bribes, threats, extortion. Even those who had once been allies had been coerced into silence. My parents' network of control was larger than I had ever imagined. "They've built a cage around you," Linda whispered. "One you can't even see until you try to step outside it. I don't think they'll stop unless they're forced." I wanted to thank her, but suspicion lingered. Why risk yourself now? Why not stay loyal to them like they expect? Her eyes filled with tears. "Because I've watched them twist everything good in this family into something rotten. I can't be part of that anymore. And because I know they won't stop at destroying your life. Once you're gone, they'll turn on anyone else who stands in their way, including me." She picked up the recorder again and pressed play on one final file. The room filled with my father's voice, colder than I had ever heard it. "If Caroline won't submit voluntarily, we'll have to arrange a more permanent solution to our problem." My mother's reply followed, soft and chilling. "It may be the only way." The words echoed in my ears, turning my blood to ice. Linda's final recording made my blood run cold. "If Caroline won't submit voluntarily, we'll have to arrange a more permanent solution to our problem." Linda's recording still echoed in my mind long after she left, the words of my father and mother, plotting my permanent solution, searing themselves into my chest. I thought perhaps I had reached the peak of their cruelty, that there was nothing left they could do to shock me. But just as I convinced myself I had seen the full scope of their depravity, they proved me wrong. The next strike came not through rumors or forged papers, but directly spoken with the calmness of people who no longer bothered to pretend they were anything other than executioners. It was late evening when the call came. At first, I considered letting it ring out my hand frozen above the receiver, but a strange compulsion made me answer, as if some part of me needed to hear the venom from their own mouths. My father's voice was cool, deliberate, the same tone he once used in the boardroom when issuing ultimatums. "Caroline," he said evenly, "this is the final chance we will give you. 30 days. You will divorce Daniel and marry Jonathan, or Daniel will have an accident. Quick. Clean. No one will question it." At first I thought I had misheard him, my own father speaking of my husband's death as casually as one might discuss the weather. I forced the words out of my tightening throat, asking if he realized what he was threatening, if he knew he was talking about murdering the man I loved. His tone never shifted. "It will look like an accident. A car skidding off a wet road. A fall down the stairs. You'll mourn, but you'll recover. We are offering you mercy, Caroline. Protect him or lose him." Then came my mother's voice, soft, deceptively tender. "We don't want it to come to that, sweetheart. But you've left us no choice. This is for the good of everyone." That was the moment something broke inside me. Until then, I had clung to some fragile thread of belief that they were misguided, manipulated, warped by greed, but not evil at their core. But hearing them so calmly weigh Daniel's life as a bargaining chip forced the truth into me like ice water. There was no love left in them. They had crossed into darkness long ago. When I hung up, the phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. My body folded with it, collapsing into a sob that seemed to come from a place deeper than my lungs. Daniel found me crumpled there, rocking as though trying to hold myself together. When I managed to choke out their threat, the color drained from his face, yet he knelt beside me and held me with a steadiness that made my grief burn hotter. My parents had marked him for death, and still he comforted me. The thought both shattered and strengthened me in ways I couldn't untangle. I spent the night staring into the dark, my mind a whirl of memories and fears. Images of my childhood flickered through me. My father teaching me to ride a bike, my mother tucking me into bed. Had those moments been real, or had they always been a mask hiding the truth of what they were capable of? By dawn, I understood that clinging to illusions of parental love was a form of weakness I could no longer afford. If they were willing to kill, then I had to be willing to fight as though my life and Daniel's depended on it. That was when my thoughts turned to Beatrice. I remembered the sealed envelope Harold had given me, the one I had tucked away, afraid of what truths it might hold. My grandmother had warned me that one day I would need it, that when I could no longer deny what Edward and Vivian had become, her words would guide me. That day had come. I retrieved the box and laid it on the table, the weight of it far heavier than its size. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the thick bundle of papers. On top lay a letter written in Beatrice's careful, elegant hand. I inhaled sharply and began to read. My dearest Caroline, it began. If you are holding this, then the moment I feared has arrived. Your parents have chosen greed over love, and you stand in their way. I prepared these instructions not only as evidence of their crimes, but as a shield for you. Use them wisely. Within these pages you will find proof of theft, fraud, and more. They are not just documents, they are weapons. I turned the pages slowly, my heart pounding with each revelation. There were records of embezzlement, proof of funds siphoned from family trusts and charities' property transfers carried out illegally. Detailed names, dates, accounts all meticulously documented. Beatrice had not only uncovered their corruption, but laid out precise instructions for how I could use the evidence to dismantle them while protecting myself legally. She listed contacts I could trust, strategies for countering their inevitable retaliation, and ways to keep Daniel safe from their reach. The deeper I read, the more my grief transformed into awe. Beatrice had lived in the shadow of their corruption longer than I had, and she had spent those years quietly preparing for the day I would have to stand against them. She had believed in me enough to carve out a path through the darkness, one I could follow to safety and justice. As I reached the final page, my hands shook so violently the paper rustled like dry leaves. The tone of her letter changed here, growing urgent, stripped of caution. Caroline, you must face this truth with clear eyes. Your parents are not misguided. They are dangerous. Their hunger will not end until they are stopped. They will destroy anyone who threatens them, even you. I thought nothing more could surprise me, but the final paragraph struck with the force of a blow. There is one truth I never spoke aloud, one I saved only for you. You must know it if you are to understand the depth of their evil. Caroline, your parents killed my first husband for his inheritance. The diamond dress contains proof that will send them to prison forever. The words blurred as tears flooded my eyes. The people who had brought me into this world were not merely manipulative, not merely corrupt. They were murderers. The revelation in Beatrice's letter left me raw, my hands trembling as I held the pages that condemned my parents not only as thieves, but as murderers. For hours I sat staring at the words, willing them to blur into something less damning, but the truth remained. When Daniel came to me, his touch was steady, his presence grounding me even as I shook with the weight of what I had learned. I told him everything, every word my grandmother had written, and he listened without flinching. When I finished, I braced myself for his fear for him to echo my own despair. But instead, he tightened his grip on my hands. Then we know exactly what we're dealing with, he said firmly, and we know what we have to do. We're going to end this, Caroline. We'll end it together. His certainty steadied me more than my own strength could. The next day, Daniel contacted Harold Klein, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. Harold arrived carrying folders and documents, his expression grim but resolute. Together they explained the steps we would take to protect ourselves. Harold had already filed for restraining orders against Edward and Vivian, citing the threats, the fabricated evidence, and the attempt to have me committed. He had also arranged for private security funded through Beatrice's estate men, who would watch our building, monitor our movements, and ensure we were no longer vulnerable to sudden attacks. I resisted at first, feeling a pang of humiliation at the idea of needing guards against my own family, but Daniel reminded me that survival was not weakness. They don't get to scare us into hiding, he said. They wanted us defenseless. We won't give them that satisfaction. In the days that followed, the presence of security became both a reminder of the danger and a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. I no longer startled at every knock on the door or shadow in the hallway. For the first time in months, I could sleep without jerking awake to the sound of phantom footsteps. Daniel remained vigilant, checking locks, speaking with the men Harold had assigned, learning their names, as though he needed to trust them fully before trusting the safety they provided. His calm determination reassured me in ways words could not. With protection in place, we turned to the next step, building the case. On the table in our apartment, we spread Beatrice's documents and Natalie's recordings, arranging them into a timeline of betrayal and crime. The embezzlement records were damning enough, but combined with the recordings of my parents discussing fraud, extortion, and worse, the pattern became undeniable. Harold guided us, showing how to present the evidence in a way that would withstand the inevitable legal scrutiny. He spoke of prosecutors who would not be intimidated, of journalists who would see the value in uncovering the corruption of two of the city's most prominent figures. I spent long nights poring over the material, my stomach turning at the scale of the lies. Every page revealed another theft, another manipulation, another life twisted or ruined by their greed. It was no longer only about me. The breadth of their crimes had left scars on countless others who had trusted them. With every revelation, my resolve hardened. This was not just a fight for my freedom. It was a fight to stop them from hurting anyone else. Daniel stood by me through it all, his presence as constant as breath. He listened when the weight of the evidence made me cry, held me when guilt for ever loving them made my chest ache, and reminded me that none of it was my fault. One evening, as I buried my face against his chest, I whispered, "What if this destroys us? What if they manage to take everything before the truth comes out?" He tilted my chin up, his gaze unwavering. "Then we fight harder. You are not alone anymore, Caroline. You will never be alone again." Our marriage, instead of crumbling under the relentless pressure, grew stronger. We stopped pretending to shield each other from the fear, and instead shared it openly, turning vulnerability into strength. Daniel's loyalty was tested again and again, but he never faltered. He even told me of a second attempt by my father to buy him off a meeting arranged under the guise of a truce. Edward had repeated his offer, increasing the sum, trying to lure Daniel away with promises of wealth and freedom if he abandoned me. When Daniel refused, my father escalated to threats, speaking openly of accidents and disappearances. Daniel recounted it with calm resolve, his voice steady, even as my hands shook, listening. "I won't leave you," he said simply. "Not for money, not for safety, not for anything. If they want to get to you, they'll have to go through me." Hearing him say that filled me with both terror and awe. Terror because I knew my father was capable of making good on his threats. Awe because Daniel's love stood firm even in the face of death. For so long, I had been told I was a burden, a liability, a mistake. But here was a man who saw me as worth protecting at any cost. His loyalty gave me strength I hadn't known I possessed. Together, we drafted the plan that would finally bring the nightmare to an end. Harold would prepare the legal case, organizing the documents into a comprehensive indictment. Daniel and I would arrange for copies to be placed in secure locations, ensuring that even if my parents tried to silence us, the truth would still emerge. We identified allies: Natalie, who had chosen at last to stand with me, and Linda, who had risked everything to expose their network of manipulation. We rehearsed what to say, how to present the evidence in public, how to withstand the inevitable backlash when the Mercer name was dragged into the light. Through it all, I felt Beatrice's presence in every detail, as though her foresight had reached through time to guide my steps. She had prepared me for this, trusted me to carry the burden she could not. With Daniel at my side, I finally believed I could. The night before we were set to present the evidence, Daniel and I sat together in the quiet of our apartment, the city humming faintly beyond the windows. The table before us was covered with papers, photographs, and recordings, each one a fragment of truth sharpened into a weapon. I leaned against him, exhaustion heavy in my bones but resolve stronger still. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me with the same steadiness he had shown since the beginning. As we held each other, Daniel whispered, "Caroline, tomorrow, we end this nightmare forever, no matter what it costs us personally." Harold arrived the morning after Daniel and I made our vow to end the nightmare, his briefcase heavy with files and his eyes carrying the gravity of a man who had seen too much. He cleared our kitchen table with one sweeping motion and began laying out stacks of papers, folders, and digital recordings. The sheer weight of it all was overwhelming, as though decades of secrets had been waiting for this moment to come crashing into the open. I sat across from him, Daniel by my side, bracing myself for truths I already suspected but had never fully confronted. Harold's voice was calm but solemn as he began. "Caroline, the combined evidence from your grandmother, from Natalie, and from Linda is more than enough to expose Edward and Vivian. What we have here is not a desperate family falling apart. It's a 30-year record of crimes meticulously committed and covered." I felt my breath catch as he opened a folder marked with Beatrice's handwriting. Inside were documents she had preserved, proof of embezzlement from family trusts and charitable foundations. Harold spread the pages, carefully pointing out transfers hidden in shell companies, amounts siphoned under the guise of property development, and donations that never reached their intended recipients. "This would have been damning enough," Harold said, "but what Natalie and Linda have added makes it undeniable." He pressed play on one of Linda's recordings. My parents' voices filled the room, cold and calculated, discussing bribes and fabricating reports, their words leaving no room for misunderstanding. When the recording ended, Harold opened another folder, this one compiled from Natalie's contributions. She had documented conversations where Edward and Vivian boasted of orchestrating smear campaigns against business rivals and manipulating partners until they collapsed financially. They didn't just prey on me. They preyed on anyone who stood in their way. Harold's finger tapped the folder as he spoke. "Your parents didn't stumble into corruption. They perfected it. They destroyed other families, systematically fraud, extortion, even violence disguised as unfortunate accidents." The word accidents sent a chill through me. Harold slid another set of documents across the table. This time, coroner's reports and insurance claims spanning 3 decades. He spoke with the grim detachment of a lawyer who had learned not to flinch at horror. Several deaths once considered accidental, the car crash of their business partner in the early 90s, the house fire that killed a cousin. The boating tragedy involving an investor were not coincidences. The pattern is too clear. Each victim stood in the way of their financial schemes, and each death benefited them directly. My stomach turned as I scanned the reports. The handwriting of coroners I didn't know, the bland official language of tragedy, all of it now read like a code for murder. Beatrice's warning about their capacity for darkness echoed in my ears. They hadn't just threatened Daniel's life to manipulate me. They had done it before to others. Real families had been torn apart, children left without parents, communities scarred, all so Edward and Vivian could tighten their grip on power. Daniel reached for my hand, grounding me as the weight of it threatened to crush me. Harold continued, his voice steady. "You need to understand, Caroline. This is bigger than you. You've seen the cruelty they directed at you, but multiply that by dozens of families, by generations. They are not misguided parents, they are predators. This isn't about saving yourself anymore. It's about preventing the next family from falling into the same trap." His words pierced through me. For months, my fight had felt personal, survival, dignity, freedom. But now I saw the broader canvas of destruction. If I stayed silent, if I walked away, others would continue to suffer. I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was the only one who could end their cycle. Harold showed us the strategy. He explained how the financial records, the recordings, and the eyewitness testimony would be combined into a case so comprehensive it could not be dismissed. He spoke of prosecutors who had long suspected the Mercers, but lacked proof, of journalists who would expose their crimes once the evidence became public. He outlined protective measures for me and Daniel, legal shields and contingency plans should Edward and Vivian try to retaliate. Every detail was meticulously thought out, a roadmap not just to justice, but to survival. As I listened, a strange calm settled over me. For so long, fear had been my constant companion, a fog that clouded every thought. But now, beneath the fear, there was clarity. My parents were not just my tormentors. They were predators who had devoured lives for decades. And I, armed with Beatrice's foresight, Natalie's courage, and Linda's sacrifice, had the means to stop them. I wasn't just fighting for my own marriage or my own future. I was fighting for every silent victim who never had the chance to fight back. The sun dipped lower as Harold packed away some of the files, leaving the most critical evidence in a locked case he would take directly to the authorities. His face softened as he looked at me. Caroline, I know this isn't easy. To see your parents not as misguided but as criminals of the worst kind, it takes something out of you. But you need to know the truth completely, no matter how much it hurts. He hesitated, as though weighing whether to speak the final piece. Then he met my eyes with a gravity that made my chest tighten. There is one more thing you should know. I braced myself, already numb from the avalanche of revelations, but his next words sliced through what was left of my illusions. Caroline, you're not their first child to resist their control, but you're the first to survive long enough to fight back. Harold's final words haunted me long after he left, echoing in the quiet of our apartment, like a bell that would not stop tolling. You're not their first child to resist their control, but you're the first to survive long enough to fight back. It was a revelation that clawed at my heart and left me sleepless. I lay awake beside Daniel, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the possibility that there had been others' children silenced, erased, or manipulated into destruction before me. My parents had built an empire not just on stolen money, but on broken lives. That truth sat heavy on me, and for a long time I could not move. The next evening, a soft knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, Natalie stood there. My sister, who had so often been my rival, the chosen child, the obedient daughter. Her posture was uncertain, her eyes red-rimmed, and she looked nothing like the confident shadow of our parents I had always known. She asked in a trembling voice if she could come in. I stepped aside without a word. She sat at the table, folding and unfolding her hands, her gaze darting around the room before finally meeting mine. Caroline, she began, her voice hoarse, I can't hide any more. If this goes to court, if everything comes out, then I need to tell the truth. All of it. My stomach clenched. For years, truth had been a scarce thing between us. She started at the beginning, her words tumbling out like stones she had carried too long. She spoke of the ways our parents had turned us against each other, how she had basked in their approval because it was the only currency she knew. She admitted she had joined in their criticism of me repeating their words, not because she always believed them, but because she was desperate to be seen, desperate to be valued. I let them convince me you were selfish, reckless, impossible to love, she whispered. I thought agreeing with them would make me safe. I thought it would make me matter. But all it did was make me part of their cruelty. Her eyes filled as she described the meetings. I had not been privy to the whispered strategy sessions where my parents plotted how to strip me of my autonomy. They didn't just talk about disowning you, she said. They talked about erasing you legally. They paid doctors to write reports claiming you were unstable. I saw the money handed over. I heard Father tell one of them, "We don't need truth. We just need enough paper for a judge to believe she's a danger to herself." She choked on the words and pressed her shaking hands to her face. I sat frozen as she recounted how lawyers had been instructed to prepare petitions, how our mother rehearsed stories of my supposed breakdowns, practicing her lines with tears ready to fall at will. Natalie's voice faltered. They wanted to put you away forever, Caroline. Not just for evaluation, for permanent care. They wanted your marriage annulled, your inheritance taken, your life rewritten as madness. Daniel reached across the table and gripped my hand, but I could not look away from my sister. Her confession poured out faster now, as though she feared she would lose the courage if she slowed. And I let it happen. I didn't stop them. I didn't warn you. I was in the room when they planned to drug you. I knew it and I said nothing. That silence makes me complicit. The word complicit hung in the air like a sentence. She lowered her gaze. I know what that means. It means I could be charged too. I might go to prison for what I allowed. But I can't keep living under their shadow pretending I'm innocent while I know the truth. I would rather face punishment telling the truth than stay silent and watch them destroy you. I swallowed hard emotions colliding, anger, sorrow, and a flicker of hope I had not expected. Natalie was finally breaking free, tearing away the mask our parents had forced on her for years. She described how she had begun documenting things first for self-protection, then for conscience. She had stolen drafts of medical reports, copied meeting notes, and recorded conversations where our parents spoke openly of their plans. If I testify, she said, her eyes finally steady, it won't just confirm the evidence you already have. It will show the world what it looked like from the inside. Their own daughter saying it. That's what will make it undeniable. I asked if she truly understood what she was giving up if she realized she would be implicating herself. She nodded, tears streaking her face, but her chin lifted. Yes, and I accept it. I deserve some of what's coming. But I won't let them use me to hurt you anymore. I won't let them poison me into silence again. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the clock. For a moment, I saw not the sister who had sided against me for so many years, but the girl I had once shared a bedroom with, the one who used to whisper stories in the dark before our parents' voices drowned everything out. My heart ached with the loss of what we might have been, but in that moment, I also felt something like healing. Natalie straightened, her voice firmer now, as though her confession had burned away the last of her fear. Caroline, she said I helped them abuse you for years, but I'd rather go to prison than let them destroy another day of your life. Harold's revelation that I was the first child to survive resisting my parents lingered like a shadow I could not shake. It haunted me through the night, a cruel whisper that suggested there had been others like me, others who never lived long enough to fight back. My mind spun with dark possibilities, and for a brief moment I wondered if that was to be my fate too. But Daniel's steady presence beside me reminded me that survival had already been won in part. What remained now was justice. At dawn the following day, Harold called with news that jolted me upright in bed. His voice was clipped all business. Caroline, your parents attempted to flee the country. They were arrested at the airport this morning. For a moment, I couldn't respond, my throat dry. He continued. They liquidated millions overnight, packed suitcases full of cash and jewelry, and tried to board a private jet bound for a country without extradition. The authorities intercepted them before the plane left the hangar. The image seared itself into my mind. Edward and Vivian Mercer, once the embodiment of poise and power, reduced to fugitives dragging luggage stuffed with stolen wealth across the polished floor of an airport. It should have filled me with satisfaction, but instead I felt only a dull ache. This was the empire they had sacrificed their souls for, and it ended not in glory, but in disgrace. By midday, the story had broken across every news channel. I watched in silence as grainy footage played of them being led through the airport by federal agents. The cameras captured Edward's rigid jaw, the fury in his eyes as he tried to shield himself from the flashbulbs. He still looked like a man trying to intimidate the world into obedience, even as handcuffs gleamed at his wrists. Vivian, impossibly composed even in disgrace, tilted her chin up at the reporters shouting questions, her lips curling into a sneer that said she still believed herself above them. They looked less like broken criminals than monarchs unwilling to concede their throne dragged against their will into the light of reality. Seeing them that way stirred emotions I struggled to name. A part of me felt vindicated, but another part felt grief so sharp it cut through the satisfaction. I remembered birthdays where I had waited for their affection only to receive lectures about duty. I remembered nights when I wished my mother would hug me instead of evaluating me like a flawed investment. All those memories collided with the image of them now, and I realized that whatever chance at reconciliation had once existed was slipping further and further away. The transcripts of their interrogation arrived through Harold later that evening. I read them slowly, my hands trembling, as though I was holding evidence of a crime against my very soul. Edward's responses were filled with venom. He told the detectives, "We gave her everything. We groomed her to secure our future. And she betrayed us for a pathetic dream of independence. She's weak. She's selfish. She destroyed the life we built." His words struck me harder than I expected. Even in the face of exposure, he clung to the belief that I owed him obedience, that love was measured only by how well I served their ambitions. Vivian's answers chilled me even more. The detectives asked her directly if she regretted the years of manipulation, the emotional and financial abuses. She laughed, a laugh transcribed in the report, but echoing vividly in my imagination. "Caroline was never really our daughter," she said. "She was an investment. We nurtured her, trained her, shaped her, all to secure our legacy. But she failed. She chose weakness. She chose mediocrity. And now we pay the price." The detectives pressed her further, asking if she had ever felt love for me, if she ever saw me as more than a pawn. Her reply was scalding. "Love, don't be absurd. Children are assets. Some yield returns, some don't. Caroline was a failed venture. We should have cut our losses years ago." I stared at the page until the letters blurred. I had thought I had steeled myself for their cruelty, but reading those words hollowed me out in ways I hadn't imagined. I wanted to believe that somewhere buried deep there had been maternal affection, that the woman who tucked me into bed as a child had meant it even for a fleeting second. But her own words erased that illusion. I was never a daughter to her. I was a ledger entry, a commodity, and when I did not pay dividends, I was worthless. Harold cautioned me that this lack of remorse would actually strengthen the case, that it revealed their true nature more clearly than any evidence we could have provided. But logic could not soothe the wound. It was one thing to suspect they saw me as a tool. It was another to hear it from their own mouths, preserved forever in transcripts that the world would read. What followed in the report was worse still. When the detectives asked Vivian what she would have done differently if given the chance, she didn't hesitate. She leaned back, crossed her legs, and delivered her answer with chilling calm. "I should have drowned Caroline at birth rather than waste 25 years trying to make her profitable." The words leapt off the page and struck me like a physical blow. My breath caught, my chest tightened, and I felt the room tilt around me. Whatever tiny thread of hope I had carried, that perhaps they could change, that perhaps some scrap of parental instinct had survived, snapped in that instant. My mother had spoken not only her truth, but her wish, a desire that I had never existed at all unless I could be profitable. Mother's words to the detective destroyed my last hope for reconciliation. I should have drowned Caroline at birth, rather than waste 25 years trying to make her profitable. The words from my mother's interrogation had barely settled in my bones when the trial began. I walked into the courthouse with Daniel at my side, Harold leading the way and Natalie following just behind. Cameras lined the steps. Voices clamored and microphones thrust toward me, but I kept my eyes forward. The world wanted to see the woman who had brought down Edward and Vivian Mercer, but I was still just a daughter walking into the public crucifixion of her parents. Inside, the air was hushed, tense, thick with anticipation. The prosecution had built its case meticulously, and I knew my testimony would be the cornerstone. For weeks, I had rehearsed the words, but nothing could prepare me for the weight of speaking them aloud in front of my parents. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. Edward and Vivian sat at the defense table, both dressed impeccably, as though they could will back the illusion of respectability. My father's eyes burned with restrained fury, and my mother's face was a mask of cold indifference. They looked like royalty stripped of a throne, but determined to maintain their posture. Seeing them there made my stomach twist, but I squared my shoulders. This was no longer a family conflict hidden behind closed doors. This was history being written in public. When my name was called, I rose slowly, each step toward the witness stand, feeling like a march across a battlefield. I raised my hand, swore the oath, and settled into the chair. For a moment I let my eyes roam the room. I saw Daniel's unwavering gaze, Harold's nod of encouragement, Natalie's tear-streaked face. And then I looked at my parents. Edward sneered faintly as though daring me to open my mouth. Vivian's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that promised she would not yield even here. My heart pounded, but I began to speak. I told the court about my childhood, about the punishments that masqueraded as lessons, the endless comparisons to Natalie, the constant reminders that I was nothing unless I conformed. I described how affection was withheld like currency, how discipline crossed into cruelty under the excuse of preparing me for responsibility. I recounted the manipulation, the gaslighting, the years of being told I was selfish whenever I resisted their control. As I spoke, I saw heads shaking in disbelief among the spectators, reporters scribbling furiously, and even some jurors visibly recoiling at the details. Then I moved into the evidence. I spoke of Beatrice's foresight, the documents she had hidden in the diamond dress, and how those papers revealed decades of embezzlement and fraud. I laid out the financial crimes, the siphoned funds from charities, the shell corporations used to launder stolen money, the millions hidden while they preached about sacrifice and duty. Harold had prepared exhibits, and as each chart and transfer was projected onto screens, the murmur in the courtroom grew louder. The illusion of the Mercer legacy was collapsing in real time, but the financial corruption was only the surface. I told the court about the darker truths, the accidents that were no accidents at all. The boating incident that killed an investor just before he exposed discrepancies in their accounts. The house fire that conveniently destroyed evidence of a fraudulent land deal. The car crash of a business partner whose death funneled millions into Mercer-controlled assets. Beatrice had collected the records, Natalie had provided the corroboration, and Linda's recordings filled in the blanks. Piece by piece, I painted the picture of predators who had used not only deceit, but death as tools of empire building. The room grew silent, as if even air was reluctant to move. And then I turned to the personal conspiracy against me. I explained how my parents had planned to force me into an arranged marriage, how they had drugged me, how they had attempted to institutionalize me with falsified medical reports. I detailed the bribes paid to doctors, the perjury committed to obtain court orders, the threats against Daniel's life, the attempts to destroy his career and reputation. I told them about the nights I had awakened to find my future being dismantled piece by piece, about the despair of realizing that the people who gave me life valued money over my happiness, control over my freedom. I spoke through the lump in my throat, through tears that blurred my vision, but I did not stop. When I finished my account, the prosecutor asked me what this had cost me personally. I took a deep breath and answered as honestly as I could. It cost me the belief that parents love unconditionally. It cost me trust, safety, and the childhood I should have had. But I am here because silence would cost me even more. If I stay silent, they will keep doing this to others, and I refuse to let that happen. For a long moment, the courtroom was still. Then, as if on cue, other voices began to rise. One by one, people stood to testify. A woman described how her husband had been ruined by fraudulent business partnerships with Edward. A man recounted how his sister had died in what had been ruled an accident, but now seemed orchestrated. Former employees came forward with stories of intimidation, coercion, and ruined careers. Victims I had never met who had suffered quietly in the shadow of the Mercer name were suddenly speaking with courage. My testimony had unlocked theirs, and together we revealed the full scope of my parents' monstrosity. The trial became more than a legal proceeding, it became a reckoning. The jury heard stories of fraud, of theft, of children punished under the guise of discipline that was in truth psychological torment. They heard of families bankrupted, of lives lost, of years of exploitation, hidden behind the polished facade of the Mercer family. The prosecution wove it all into a tapestry of sociopathy, showing Edward and Vivian not as flawed parents, but as predators who had used their roles as shields for cruelty. Throughout it all, my parents sat impassive, though I caught flashes of rage in my father's clenched fists and my mother's narrowed eyes. They whispered furiously to their attorneys, but nothing could undo what had been said, what had been proven. Their empire of lies had crumbled, and the world was watching the dust settle. At last, the prosecutor asked if I had anything further to add. I looked directly at the jury, then at the sea of faces watching, and finally at the two people who had once been the center of my world. I was raised to believe obedience was love, that sacrifice was duty, that independence was betrayal. Today I choose truth. My parents are not victims of circumstance. They are architects of suffering, and they must answer for it. As I finished testifying, Father's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful little bitch! After everything we gave you, this is how you repay us!" The courtroom erupted after my father's outburst. The words, "You ungrateful little bitch," echoing against the high ceilings like a curse flung into history. The judge banged his gavel for order, his stern eyes cutting across the room to silence the chaos. I sat frozen on the stand, my body trembling, but something inside me had shifted. For years, my father's rage had left me small, fearful, and desperate for approval. Now, as his fury spilled into the open, I realized it was no longer my burden. It was evidence. It was proof of who he truly was. The trial stretched on for days, but the momentum had already turned. Witness after witness took the stand. Prosecutors stacked crime upon crime, and the defense struggled to spin a web thick enough to hide the truth. By the time closing arguments arrived, the Mercer legacy had been reduced to rubble. When the jury filed back into the courtroom with their verdict, I gripped Daniel's hand so tightly my knuckles turned white. The foreman read the charges aloud, each word striking like a hammer. Guilty of multiple counts of fraud. Guilty of conspiracy to commit embezzlement. Guilty of child abuse disguised as discipline. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. And then the final blow, guilty of first-degree murder tied to the deaths that had once been ruled as accidents, but were now revealed as deliberate eliminations. My father showed no emotion, his jaw set in stone, while my mother blinked rapidly, her face pale but still proud. They looked not like a couple brought to justice, but like rulers deposed from a kingdom they still believed was theirs by right. Sentencing came the next morning. The courthouse was again filled to capacity, and this time the atmosphere was electric with expectation. Families of victims packed the benches, their faces a mixture of grief and anticipation. The judge entered his black robe billowing, and I held my breath. He began with my father. "Edward Mercer. You stand convicted of multiple murders, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, and decades of abuse carried out under the guise of parenting and business discipline. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your lack of remorse has been noted throughout these proceedings." His voice hardened. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars, removed from the power you so brazenly abused." The gavel came down, and though my father did not flinch, I felt something crack inside me. Life without parole. A man who had once controlled every corner of my existence would die in a cell with nothing but his own memories for company. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only a mask of contempt. He glanced toward me briefly, his eyes cold, and I knew he still blamed me for his downfall. Then the judge turned to Vivian. "Vivian Mercer, you stand convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and 30 years of systematic emotional and physical abuse carried out against your own child. While the state has not tied you directly to the murders, your complicity in covering them, and in attempting to institutionalize your daughter to silence her, cannot be ignored." He paused, his gaze steady. "The court sentences you to 30 years in prison. You will serve this time as acknowledgement of the countless lives you warped in pursuit of wealth and control." For the first time, my mother's composure cracked. Her lips parted in disbelief, her fingers clenching as though she might rise from her seat. She shook her head slowly, her eyes darting toward the gallery as though looking for someone to intervene. 30 years was not life, but for a woman who had wrapped herself in luxury and influence, it might as well have been eternity. The judge then looked directly at me. "Caroline Mercer," he said, his tone softening. "Your courage in coming forward has been noted by this court. By speaking the truth, you not only secured justice for yourself, but brought light to crimes that would otherwise have remained buried. You have prevented future victims and given voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. This court acknowledges the extraordinary strength it took for you to stand here." My throat tightened, tears stinging my eyes, but I lifted my chin. For once, someone in authority was not silencing me, not doubting me, but affirming what I had endured. When the deputies moved to escort my parents from the courtroom, the reality of it settled over me like a heavy blanket. Edward stood tall, unbending, but the chains around his wrists and ankles clinked with each step, stripping him of the illusion of power. Vivian faltered slightly as she rose, and for the first time I saw age in her, the fragility of a woman who had always projected invincibility. Together they were led toward the side doors, their silhouettes shrinking against the expanse of the courtroom. I should have felt triumph. After all, this was the victory I had fought for, the justice that had seemed impossible when I first discovered their betrayal. And yet what I felt was far more complicated. Relief, yes, relief that they could never again touch me, never again manipulate my life, never again threaten Daniel or anyone I loved. But intertwined with it was grief, a hollow sorrow for the parents I had never truly had. Watching them go, I realized I had spent years yearning for love that had never existed, trying to earn approval that was never meant to be given. What I was losing now was not parents, but the illusion that someday they might have become the people I needed. The courtroom buzzed with chatter as people began to rise, but I stayed seated, staring at the doors that had closed behind them. Daniel squeezed my hand, Natalie leaned against me in silent support, and Harold placed a steadying palm on my shoulder. They were here, the family I had built out of honesty and loyalty, but a part of me still ached for the family I had lost to greed and cruelty. As the deputy's footsteps faded down the hall, a sob welled in my chest, but I held it back. Justice had been done. The world would know who Edward and Vivian Mercer really were, stripped of the masks they had worn for decades. But justice did not erase the absence of love. It did not rewrite the childhood that had been shaped by fear instead of warmth, manipulation instead of guidance. Watching my parents disappear into prison, I realized I wasn't mourning their punishment, but grieving the childhood I never had with parents who actually loved me. When the heavy doors closed behind my parents and the sound of chains echoed down the courthouse corridor, I sat frozen in my seat, my breath caught in my throat. Justice had been done, but the silence left in their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. For the first time in my life, I was free, but freedom carried its own weight. The weeks that followed blurred with paperwork hearings and the relentless gaze of a public hungry for every detail of the Mercer downfall. Through it all, Natalie stayed close. She no longer carried herself like the favored daughter who had once basked in their approval. She walked with the hesitation of someone learning how to move again after being bound for too long. Her sentencing came quickly. The prosecution acknowledged her complicity, but also her bravery in testifying against our parents. When the judge read her sentence, his voice carried a balance of sternness and compassion. "Natalie Mercer, your cooperation and genuine remorse have been noted by this court. You aided in exposing crimes of unprecedented scope and in preventing further harm. For this reason, you will receive a suspended sentence contingent on continued cooperation and participation in therapy to address the psychological damage inflicted upon you by your upbringing." I looked at her then and saw tears shining in her eyes, not from fear, but from relief. She would not lose her freedom, but she would face her demons. True to the court's directive, Natalie began therapy almost immediately. At first, she resisted, as though speaking about our childhood would unravel what little control she still felt. But slowly, she began to let go. She told me of nightmares she had carried since we were children, of the constant pressure to perform, of the gnawing fear that any mistake would erase her worth. In those sessions, she learned to separate her own voice from the voices of our parents that had lived rent-free in her mind for decades. She began to build herself not as the daughter they demanded, but as a woman untangling truth from manipulation. Watching her take those steps was painful and beautiful all at once. Meanwhile, I faced the labyrinth of financial inheritance. The state seized nearly everything tied to criminal activity, stripping away the illusions of wealth that had once defined the Mercer name. Yet what remained was still staggering properties, investments, and accounts that, though stained by their origin, were now legally mine. At first, I wanted nothing to do with it. The idea of benefiting from money soaked in suffering felt like a betrayal to every victim. But Harold reminded me that money is not moral on its own. It is what we choose to do with it that defines its value. Slowly, an idea took shape. I established the Beatrice Foundation in honor of the woman who had seen the truth long before anyone else, the woman who had hidden the evidence that became the key to my survival. The Foundation's mission was clear: to provide support for victims of family abuse and financial manipulation, people trapped in webs spun by those who should have protected them. We offered legal aid, counseling, and emergency resources for those who, like me, had once felt powerless against the very people who were supposed to love them. Writing those first checks, signing the paperwork that turned inherited poison into something healing, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than any I had ever known. Natalie surprised me by asking to be part of it. At first I hesitated, unsure if she was ready, but she insisted. "If I can help even one person escape what we went through," she said softly, "then maybe everything we endured won't just be scars. Maybe it can be light." She took on administrative work, organizing outreach programs, and in those tasks I saw her grow. She was no longer my rival, no longer my judge. She was my partner in something bigger than both of us. Our relationship did not heal overnight. Years of resentment and betrayal do not vanish with a single apology or even a heartfelt testimony. There were days when I still felt anger simmer beneath my skin, days when her presence reminded me of wounds I had not fully closed. But there were also evenings when we sat together in quiet understanding, sharing memories not to reopen them, but to lay them to rest. We spoke honestly, sometimes haltingly, about the ways our parents had twisted us against each other. And in those conversations, I began to see the sister I had longed for emerge from the shell of the favored daughter. Slowly, trust grew in small gestures. She would bring dinner when I was too exhausted to cook. I would sit with her after therapy sessions, listening without judgment. We laughed at memories that no longer had the power to wound us, and we cried over the ones that still did. In time, we learned that love between siblings could be chosen, built brick by brick, even if the foundation had been fractured by cruelty. The estate we had once dreaded became a place of rebirth. The Mercer mansion, stripped of its grandeur by investigators and emptied of the arrogance that had once filled its halls, was transformed into the headquarters of the Foundation. The dining room, where we had once been pitted against each other over silver platters, became a conference space where survivors gathered to share their stories. The library that had once held ledgers of deceit now stored legal guides for victims seeking justice. Each corner of that house, once a shrine to control, became a testament to resilience. One evening, months after the sentencing, Natalie and I sat at the long table where we had once eaten under our parents' watchful eyes. Now it was just the two of us, plates of simple food between us, laughter mingling with the clink of cutlery. I looked at her then, not as the girl who had betrayed me, not as the rival who had competed for scraps of affection, but as the sister who had finally chosen truth. For the first time, I felt the possibility of a future not bound by the past. Looking at Natalie across the dinner table, I realized we were finally free to discover who we really were without our parents' manipulation defining every aspect of our identity. The night I sat across from Natalie at the dinner table, realizing that we were finally free to discover who we truly were, marked the first time in my life I felt the air clear of my parents' shadow. For so long, their presence had been the invisible weight pressing down on every decision, every relationship, every hope I dared to hold. Now, with them behind bars, and with the foundation we were building gaining strength, the future stretched before me, not as something predetermined by others, but as a landscape waiting to be shaped by love, resilience, and purpose. Daniel and I leaned into that freedom together. In the weeks that followed, our lives settled into a rhythm that felt foreign and precious. We no longer woke to anonymous threats or stalkers sent by my father. We no longer feared that one wrong move would bring their wrath crashing down. Instead, we woke to the sound of morning birds, to coffee shared at the kitchen table, to the simple, quiet joy of building something new. Daniel devoted himself wholeheartedly to the work of the foundation, often reminding me that we weren't just living for ourselves anymore, but for every survivor who walked through our doors. Together, we created programs that paired legal experts with victims, ensuring no one would face the labyrinth of the justice system alone. We funded counseling centers where survivors of familial abuse could find a safe place to unravel the lies that had been fed to them. Each success story, each tearful thank you felt like a stone placed firmly into the bridge we were building between pain and healing. The estate, once a gilded cage, became a resource for others. The wealth my parents had hoarded through cruelty and manipulation was redirected to restore lives rather than ruin them. We held workshops in the mansion that once housed whispered conspiracies, now echoing with voices of empowerment and laughter. We transformed the study where my father had plotted financial schemes into a library filled with resources for survivors. Even the dining hall, once a stage for my mother's theatrical scolding, became a gathering place for families relearning how to love without condition. It was as if the very walls were being rewritten, their memories overwritten with something good at last. Still, one relic from that dark past remained something too symbolic to ignore. The diamond dress sat carefully preserved in its protective case, its jewels glinting in the light like silent witnesses. It was more than a garment. It was a vessel of survival, the place where Beatrice had hidden the evidence that saved me and brought my parents to justice. For months I had left it untouched, unable to decide its fate. But the answer came to me one afternoon as I walked through the new gallery wing of the City Museum, an exhibition dedicated to stories of resilience and resistance. That was where it belonged, not locked away in secrecy, not worn as a reminder of betrayal, but displayed as a testament to courage. When I donated the dress, I asked that the plaque beside it honor not me, but Beatrice. The inscription read, "This dress safeguarded the truth of a family torn apart by greed." Beatrice Mercer, in protecting her granddaughter, left behind not only evidence, but a legacy of courage. May this story remind us that love is not measured in wealth, but in sacrifice and truth. Standing in front of the display on the day it was unveiled, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Grief for what had been lost, pride for what had been saved, and gratitude for the grandmother who had believed in me when no one else did. Visitors stopped and read their faces, shifting from curiosity to solemn recognition, and I knew then that the dress would carry our story forward, warning others of the monsters who hide behind the mask of parenthood. Life with Daniel grew deeper in those months, our bond tested by storms, but now nourished by purpose. He often reminded me that love is not proven by grand gestures, but by the daily choice to stand beside one another. Every morning I watched him pour his energy into the foundation meeting, with families guiding young survivors who reminded us of our younger selves. And every evening when we sat together exhausted but content, I realized how extraordinary it was to have a partner who loved without conditions, who did not see me as an asset, but as a person worthy of protection and freedom. Our marriage became not an escape from my past, but the anchor that allowed me to face it without fear. Natalie, too, continued her transformation. Therapy was not easy for her. She often came to me shaken by memories she had repressed for years. But little by little she unraveled the lies we had both been forced to swallow. She began to laugh more freely, to cry without shame, to admit when she was afraid rather than hiding behind performance. We worked together on the foundation, and in those shared hours, the bond of sisterhood, long strangled by manipulation, began to take root again. We were not yet healed, but we were healing, and that difference meant everything. One evening, months after the dress was donated, I returned home to find an envelope waiting in the mailbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, and uneven. Inside was a letter written by a young woman. Her words spilled across the page with urgency. She was being forced into an arranged marriage by her parents, who told her she was selfish for resisting. She had read about my story in the newspapers, had seen the dress in the museum, and had clung to it like a lifeline. I don't know who else to turn to. The letter read, "They say family knows best, but what if family is the one destroying you? Please, if you can help me." I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time, my heart pounding. This was the moment I understood with clarity why Beatrice had done what she had. She hadn't only saved me, she had created a path for others to follow, a beacon for those still trapped in the darkness I had once lived in. Her protection had not ended with her death. It was alive now in me, in Daniel, in Natalie, in the Foundation, and in the lives we were changing. Reading that desperate letter, I understood that Grandma Beatrice hadn't just saved me from my parents, but prepared me to save others from the same kind of family monsters disguised as loving parents. And that is how my journey with the diamond dress, my grandmother's courage, and the truth about my parents came to an end. What began as betrayal and cruelty ended in freedom, justice, and a new purpose to help others break free from the same kind of chains. I know many of you who are listening have lived through family struggles of your own, moments when love was twisted into control or when loyalty was demanded instead of given freely. My story is not just about survival, but about the power of standing up even when it means standing against those who gave you life. If you have ever been silenced, I hope you hear in my words that your voice matters and that telling your truth can change everything. I would love to hear what you think. Have you ever faced situations where family ties became a source of pain rather than comfort? And how did you find the strength to move forward? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your experiences may give courage to someone else who needs it right now. And if you want to keep hearing stories that uncover hidden truths, expose betrayal, and celebrate resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every story we share here is a reminder that even in the darkest betrayals there can be light, and that none of us are truly alone in this struggle.